Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Chitra Singla. I welcome everybody on behalf of Research and Publication Committee of IIM Ahmedabad for this interesting workshop, very unique workshop, which is going to talk about Census National Sample Survey and historical research methods. So what the workshop is going to focus on is that what kind of data is available on census and national sample survey, which kind of spans over more than 7-8 decades, and how to use that data, what kind of variables are there, what kind of interdisciplinary work one can do, and what kind of methods one can use for both qualitative and quantitative research. And for this, we have a very accomplished professor with us, Professor Chinmay Tumbe, who is faculty in economics area of IIMA. And Chinmay has accomplished a lot at a very young age, and one can see that his star-studded academic profile, that he has been an alum of London School of Economics and Political Science, and also IIM Bangalore. Before joining IIM Ahmedabad, he was with Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad. In 2018, he was also a visiting scholar in business history at Harvard Business School. And for me personally, the biggest achievement of Chinmay has been that he published a book, and very interesting book, on India Moving, a history of migration in 2018, and that has been received very well. And with that history, I'm sure all of you are going to enjoy this workshop and learn a lot. Over to you, Chinmay.
Thanks a lot. Chitra, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So welcome to everybody. I think a lot of people have registered for this workshop, which I think shows the kind of demand for this kind of a topic. What I'm going to cover today is topics very close to my heart, in the sense that when I was a PhD student, I spent a lot of time wrestling with census data, national sample survey data, simply because these are the two largest data sets which cover sufficiently large geography of India. And also because I have an interest in history, it also goes back in time substantially. In contrast to, for example, other leading surveys, if you're working in the business school space, corporate data sets, they usually go back max 10, 20, 25 years. So basically the 1990s is the start of the data revolution in a variety of fields. And yet the NSS and census are very interesting and important today because they go back much further. So as a person who deals with time, not on a yearly basis, but on a decadal or even a century kind of a basis, these are very interesting data sets. And the idea of the workshop is to give you a quick exposure to what exists, how people are using these data sets, and to kind of push you towards thinking of how can we start talking about changes over time, but over a sort of a longer term. Now, longer term, of course, could mean anything. For an archaeologist, that's spanning many millennia. For us, it is basically moving the frame from, say, 1 decade or 2 decades, maybe 4 decades, 5 decades, or in other cases, more than a century as well. All right, so I will just share a screen. Right, so I think you can see this. I'll start right away with a little migration story. A lot of my research over the last 10 years has been on migration. And so I'll be using a lot of examples from migration, but this is not a presentation on migration. Now, this is a particular family's photograph, which we collected during fieldwork in Ratnagiri district in Maharashtra. And for the last many years, I've been using this as a starting point for migration research. But today I'm going to talk about methods. And this was a part of not the kind of survey come oral histories that we were collecting in Ratnagiri on mass migration histories from that particular place. And this gentleman that you see was a worker in Mumbai, worked all his life. There's a photo taken in Chembur in Mumbai, and the person then came back, to Ratnagiri, and he belongs to a particular generation of generation of workers who have gone to Mumbai, worked, remitted money, and come back, and then their sons, not daughters, but sons, have gone to the city. This is a rare photo where the women also in the photograph because they come to visit him in this particular case. Now, what this photograph kind of captures in kind of a research purpose, of course, a moment in time. This is a photograph taken many decades ago. but linked with the interview, linked with the oral history, which is what one would call as qualitative research. It tells you the story of one family, right, of their migration challenges, the successes, the failures, and so on. And so it's one sort of case study that we have on migration that we have in time, of course, and supplemented in kind of a presentation form by a particular photograph. I'm going to talk about Ratnagiri migration, but I'm going to show you a different media sort of format, right? And this is this. So I'm moving from a photograph to a time series. And in this time series, you'll see, that it's basically the x-axis is every year, census year, 1901, 1911, 1921 to 2000. So that's 110 years of data, which is, being put out here. And the y-axis is, these sex ratio, that is a simple females per 1,000 males. And you know that in India, we have this issue of the missing women. So in India, you see overall, the lower line, it's only about 900 to 950 females per 1,000 males. But Ratnagiri, Udupi are districts of mass migration. So I showed you that photograph of a person from that region. And what this chart very powerfully tells you in one nutshell, just one slide, one chart, is the story of persistent mass male outmigration, which has been happening not for 1 or 2 generations, but for many generations. We're saying for 110 years, the sex ratio of Ratnagiri has been elevated because the men are outside working and the women are back, right? Now, this is a very useful chart to show in research. And for that, you need to understand how these charts can be created. And that's the purpose of this workshop. I want you to appreciate that you can actually generate such data sets in India where you can compare from 1901 to 2011 and tell a 100 or 110 year story. So that's the purpose of this workshop. How do we, for example, generate a chart like this? Hopefully by the end of this workshop, you get some idea. This is the third way of looking at Ratnagiri. Now, Ratnagiri is this district out here, right? And this is a map. So earlier you saw a time series, and out here I'm showing you a map, right? And this is a map which talks about the out-migration for work captured by the National Sample Survey in 2007, right? And each district is shaded as percentage of houses was a migrant who has gone out for work. And so all the dark shaded regions are more than 25%. And so Ratnagiri is this red region out here. So more than 25% of households have gone through. So what have I done? I've shown you 3 completely different data sources, but all of them conveying a very similar point, that is, one on the left, an oral history of a particular family in Ratnagiri, which shared with me their whole experience of migration. But because it was an oral history, which is what we're going to talk later on, it captures the element of time, right? And so that's an important part of this chart, of this photograph. Then you saw a time series, which kind of conveys this element of change or persistence over time. And on the right, extreme right, you see a map of India, right? And this is what I'm going to be talking about for the next many hours actually, is these completely 3 different formats. Now, what's interesting is while you see this out here right now, what's really interesting to me is that while I started this presentation with the photograph, I actually started my research the other way around. Which means when I was doing my PhD, I first generated this map. It is through this map that told me, I never knew that Ratnagiri had such massive outmigration. It is this map, the National Sample Survey map, that told me that districts like Ratnagiri, districts like Azamgarh in UP, districts like Sivaganga in Tamil Nadu have a lot of outmigration. Because it's impossible for one particular person to know, or actually physically go to every district of India. So this kind of data is very useful. Then I discovered census data, the history of census data, and I said, hang on, this Ratnagiri story is not a 1 generation, 2 generation story. What this data is telling me is that it's much longer. And then I and many others went to Ratnagiri and collected this data from different families, and then as a very powerful visual device, a particular photograph of a particular. Right? So while I presented from the photograph to the time series to the chart, the actual data generation process was the reverse. I got to know this family because of the National Sample Survey data, because of the census data. And what I'm trying to say is that one of the things I think research in India has to sort of push itself towards is to use different data sets creatively, use quantitative and qualitative methods very creatively to tell a very powerful narrative or an argument that you want to present. And so these are completely three different formats: oral history, collected, the photograph collected through in that process, various census volumes for the second chart, and national sample survey to generate the third chart. Right? And all of them are presented in a very different format: a photograph, a time series, and a district level map. Right? But all of them linked, or all of them showing that Ratnagiri is seriously affected by out migration. Right. So this is what the workshop is about. It's basically about space and time variation, which is very critical in any social science or social studies. When I was in my PhD, I learned this very nice line. So I'm just going to quote it without attributing to anyone, saying, research is about pattern recognition. Almost all research is about pattern recognition, which means you want to see some patterns, whether in your interviews, whether in the data, whether in spatial data, and make some inferences out of that. And two core aspects of those patterns come about by variation in space and time. So, for example, a classic research question in policy, in development studies would be, why are some regions of India more literate than others? Right? And this is the classic regional variation question. Right? Why do some wards in a city have more or less slums than others? Classic question of variation. And then you have a question on time. That is, did literacy rates in India rise over time? Were they the same? Did the literacy rate of Kerala rise faster than what it was in Bihar, and so on? For which we would need to have literacy rates not only at a particular cross section of time, but going back as well. Right. So this is what the workshop is about. I'm just going to lay out. We have a lot of time. We have about 3 hours. I'm going to use the first 75 minutes to talk about the census and the NSS, more about the census, because I feel people are not using the census enough. And of course, I'll be happy to take questions after that for about half an hour. Right. So 30 minutes of Q&A. In between, if you want to ask questions and so on, please do. But we'll have a session on specifically on Q&A where you can write in the chat box, or you can just ask questions, and I can take them. Right. So that's the first 105 minutes. Then we're going to have 45 minutes on well, this part of persistence we're going to cover in the first part. It's mostly on oral histories, discourse analysis, and corpus linguistics. So a little bit more of the qualitative side on the second, and a little bit more of the quantitative side in the first part of the workshop. But note, I'm going to emphasize that both of these are very closely related. So it's not that you should, if you're more of a qualitative researcher, you should shut off in the first talk. Don't do that. I think both are very, very important. Again, this presentation, the slides, you don't need to take screenshots and so on. The presentation and the video recording will be made available on my website. So you can always come back to this whenever you want. Okay, so who's looking at this workshop? There are literally hundreds of people looking at this workshop right now, and coming from all across India, even across the world. And because census and national sample survey touch upon so many aspects of our economy and society, it's touching across a variety of fields. So of course, economics. I'm trained as an economist, and so I will show you how this is being used in economics. But of course, demography. Fundamentally, the staple for demographers has always been census data, and so it's very important. Historians are using these data sets less and less, and I'll explain why later. But students of political science, students of sociology or anthropology, geography, of course, because of spatial variation, public policy, right? Management studies. I'm currently based in the management school, so we're interested in questions of firms and so on. And of course, literally any other field. And I would argue that the census and NSS touch upon such a wide swathe of topics that virtually all of it can be studied by anybody in the social sciences. And so why have this workshop in the first place? Right? And obviously there's been a huge demand for this workshop as seen in the registration. So clearly there is something out there. So the way I look at it, most people who are not historians, which is obviously the bulk of social science research, are surprisingly not exposed to long-term temporal variation. Right? So a lot of the things we learn is about what we say is cutting-edge research, which is papers or books published in the last few years, which capture a moment in time which is fairly contemporary. Right? And so unless you yourself are a history buff and going out of your way to read, how did we get here in the first place? Unless you are motivated, it's very rarely that you yourself are exposed to data or researches which are looking at even the present through a longer time frame, right? Longer by, I mean saying more than 30 years or so. Again, so typically people don't look back in time because when they are nice ready-made data sets, for example, the CMI, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, has a lot of these nice data sets on firms and so on. And you can easily write a PhD thesis and many more, crunching those numbers, which refer to the last 5 or 10 years. The other thing is, history is for historians. So why should I bother if I'm not a historian? And I'll argue that this is a very wrong understanding because a lot of information does exist, not just for 10 or 20 years, but for more than 100 years. I just showed you one example of sex ratios, but I've talked of a variety of other things. Historians, surprisingly, also don't work with contemporary data sets. So historians that also have this bias saying, if I'm a historian, I shall only speak of the past, and past is usually defined as more than 30 years. And of course, you have people who work on ancient, periods, so-called medieval periods, so-called modern era periods. But there is also a problem with historians, I feel, who don't look enough at contemporary data and see the links with past data to make interesting arguments. The most important reason why we are having this workshop is that 20 years back, access to census and NSS data was very privileged, which means that you had to have access to the computers, you had to have access to computing powers in only select universities to get access to this. Today, it is completely democratized, right? I would say almost 95% democratized, which means by the end of this workshop, any of you could literally go to the census website and all the links I'm going to show you in this workshop and get the data set yourself free of cost, mostly, right? At a click of, so all you need is internet, right? And that has completely opened up the way research can be done. So you don't need to be at this, esteemed university to have access to data for the census and NSS anymore. You could be sitting anywhere in the world and have access, right? And most of this is now free or easily accessible. So this workshop is going to be pushing us towards thinking of interdisciplinary themes. We're going to look at space and time, but of course, by space, we are meaning India as a regional space, mostly modern day India, that is, the boundaries of India today. And in terms of time, we're going to look at this period from 1870s to now. So roughly about 140 years. That's because the Census of India starts in the 1870s. Okay, now I'm a big fan of Douglas Adams, who is one of the greatest fiction writers of time. And so we should always start our sessions by invoking some famous lines from him. So what does he have to say of space? He says space is big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely mind-blowing space is. And of course, we are not looking at intergalactic stuff. We're looking at India, but even India is very big, right? And it's impossible for anybody to know everything about India, right? You could argue that it's impossible to know everything about even a particular village or a particular city. But when it comes to India, we have to rely on data collected by others to inform our reasoning. So even if you're a hard-blooded field researcher who's who wants to go to a particular place to find out really what's happening there, there's only that many places that you can go to, right? And so getting data of more regions is very important. Douglas Adams also says, time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so. And so we are in a good position there because we're already done with lunch, hopefully. And so then this is on Zoom, so you can, have your food alongside and nobody's going to complain. And most importantly, what Douglas Adams says is, these famous 2 golden words, don't panic. Right? So I'm going to be throwing a lot of stuff in this presentation, but we have about 1 hour of Q&A, 30 minutes first and 30 minutes at the end. So feel free to make your notes, questions on the side, and then we can take it up during the Q&A session. So if there's anything you don't understand, just make a note of it as we're going along. All right, so let's start. So now when we talk about any research, this is pretty much how virtually all research happens. You need to have a particular unit of analysis, which is embedded in space. For example, you're doing, an ethnography of people on a railway station, right? There you're looking at individuals at a particular site, the railway station. But those individuals also technically have a lat-long position, which means they have a latitude and longitude embedded where you are. So even though you might say, look, I'm only at a railway station, I don't need all these fancy ideas of space and time, you are still highly embedded out there because everyone is geographically separated by some distance. Now that distance could be 1 meter as on a railway station, it could be 100 meters, kilometers, thousands of kilometers, right? And typically researchers are interested or use data at either the individual level, at the household or organization level. So in management schools, for example, the classic unit of analysis is the firm, that is the company. So broadly put, if you put up an Excel sheet, the row in your analysis is a company in a management school, right? Because you're trying to see why do some companies make more profits than others and so on. In development studies, why are some households richer than the rest? Why are some households moving up over time over the rest? Then you can have villages and towns as units of analysis. So a urban historian might be interested to know what happened to this particular city of, say, Pune over the last 100 years. Right? And so the unit of analysis then is Pune. It could be wards within Pune. It could be villages across India, villages across a particular place. In India, we also have sub-districts, that's the tehsil or the block. But we come to districts. Okay, I'm going to talk a lot today about districts because this is really the unit of analysis on which much of census and NSS research today is happening. You can also have regions, which are a collection of districts typically. You can have agroecological regions. In India, we have states, political units around a collection of districts. Then, of course, countries. So you can have cross-country research. You can have cross-continent research. Right? And so what the Census of India practically does does not look at individuals and households, though it collects data from individuals and households. You and I as researchers can't really look at that, right? So for that, we need the national sample surveys to get at this level. But at a slightly more aggregated level, the census is very useful. What about time? How frequently can we get information? The census, of course, is every decade, right? So every 10 years, there are operations of the census like the sample registration system, SRS, which collects data on birth rates, death rates annually. So even the Census of India does collect some data annually, but pretty much the census being covering, in theory, everyone, is done once in 10 years. There's also high frequency data, at a daily stock prices, for example, at a second or millisecond level. And such data is also interesting for, variety of research, but the census will not give you such data. So the census is limited. It gives you what? It gives you village, town, district data, and it gives you data at every decade. Right? So that's the first idea to understand what does the census really do. And some background of the census. When does it really start? We say the first census of India starts in about 1870. But ideas of enumeration have long been there. So even if you look at Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is the famous treatise of statecraft in India, going back many sort of centuries, almost 18 centuries, at least 18 centuries, it does recommend collecting information, for example, for tax purposes. So throughout history, the fundamental reason for people to understand about the population was to collect tax. Right? And even for the British, collecting land revenue was very important. And that was one of the reasons why they set up a very elaborate statistical collection sector. Now, you had other empires, and the word census apparently comes from censere, which means to estimate in Latin. Cutting to more modern periods, or early modern periods, you have the IIMA, right, which is a massive statistical database. Not really the census in terms of how we know it today, but it did collect information at regional block level. So you can find out in this particular region of India how much tax was collected, how many soldiers were appointed, and so on. What is the salary structure? So this is also very valuable. So if you're a historian of early modern India, the IIMA is a fantastic document to look at. And for example, Irfan Habib wrote this famous book called The Agrarian Structure, Mughal India based on this. Okay, so moving on to more modern periods. The census starts in the US in 1790, and it's been happening pretty much every 10 years in the US, 1790, 1800, and so on till date. Now, after 1800, we get Britain's first census in 1801. Then we get, Allahabad, Banaras, Dhaka. And so there are a variety of censuses even before the 1870s. In fact, the Census of India does have a series of monographs which captures all the data collected by various small officials even before the 1870s. So if some of you are interested in looking at the early 19th century, there is actually data available for that, for certain regions as well. Right? In the Madras presidency, it really starts in the mid 1800s. Madras presidency, I'll show you maps of old India, and you'll see what it looked like. And in 1852, northwestern provinces. We say the first all India census took place in 1872. Right? But it was slightly different, which means it was not synchronous. We say it was asynchronous, which means it happened at different parts of India at different points of time. This is not an ideal census, because ideally you would want to know a snapshot of the country in a particular time. But and it did not cover all of India as well. There were 17 questions asked on the questionnaire, and it collected information on basic demographic data as well, like age, religion, caste, class, race, even nationality, whether you attend school or college, whether you read or write. So if you ask me, what is one of the oldest development indicators available in India, I would say it is literacy. We have data on literacy spanning 15 censuses over 140 or 150 years now, once the census comes out next year, right? So that's a massive indicator. If you want to know, if you're doing research on education, you should definitely look up the Census of India, right? Because this is your #1 source for 150 years. Again, it has been tapped a bit. I'm going to talk about the work of Latika Chaudhary, who's done fantastic work on this. But a lot of stuff still needs to be done. The second census was 1881, and so now you see the year ending 1, right? And since then, it's happened every 10 years. So the last one was in 2011, and so 2011 we say was the 15th census, right? Note that when we say India, what do we mean by India? It was the Indian subcontinent, of course, including Pakistan and Bangladesh, before partition, but it also included Burma. So this is very interesting, because if you're studying Burma, you'll realize that actually a lot of the data on Burma between 1880s and 1930s is actually available with us, right? Because it was part of British India, and so if you want to know Indians in Burma, for example, you have these detailed district level tables on how Indians are working in different parts of Burma, and so on. Even Aden, by the way, right? So which is in the Gulf, was a part of Bombay and Sindh. Now the census was for British India. It did cover the princely states. The only place it did not cover was the other sort of colonial rulers. So the census of Goa, for example, is different, and it was in Portuguese. It's difficult to access if you don't know the language, but those documents, of course, exist in archives and so on, but it's slightly less easily accessible. And similarly with Pondicherry and the French ruled territories. Right? Now, all these censuses were conducted, which is a remarkable statistical collection fact, except in the 1940s, 1941 census was interrupted due to World War II, right? And so census operations were highly curtailed. Not all of India was enumerated. I mean, all of India was enumerated, but not all indicators, the data not on all indicators was actually released, right? So it was much more. It was not held, the Census of India was not held in Assam in 1981 and Kashmir in 1991 and in 1951 due to disturbed conditions. And this is very important, because whenever you look at India, whenever you show a time series using, suppose you say literacy rate of India between 1951 and 2011, in your notes to that table, you have to say, what are you talking about in terms of India? Right? Because we don't have the data for Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir for certain people. So if you see any good researcher, they will always have a footnote to the table on long-term time series of census saying data not available for Assam in 1981, or you say it is interpolated for these regions where you take the average across census. So for Assam 1981, you could take an average of the literacy rate between 1971 and 1991 and claim that this was roughly the literacy rate of Assam in 1981. Right? So these are some small technical points of the census. Again, after 1947, it's been administered by the Ministry of Home Affairs. So you should know who conducts the census, and it's actually governed by a legislation. It's governed by the Census Act of 1948. So in 2011, this was considered to be the biggest administrative exercise of peacetime. India is going to very soon be the most populous country of the world within the next 10 years. In 2011, 35 states and union territories were there. Of course, now more have come since then. There were 640 districts. Today, that number is more than 700. More than 5,500 tehsils, 7,000 plus towns, 6 lakh villages. Nearly 3 million people actually conducted the census. And so who does the census? It's typically government officials, school teachers, who come to your houses. And I remember in 2011, when the census official had come to a house, I was delighted because I was a researcher using census data, and I took a photograph with the census official. Very, very excited that the census person had come to my house. So that was a very memorable moment of the 2011 census. Okay, and it costs, of course, some money because it's a huge exercise that goes all across India. So how does the census actually work? So let's just look at the 2011 one. There is first a house listing and housing census which is done 1 year prior, right? So this is happening this year, 2020. So the next census is going to happen in 2021, and this is what is happening. And here they list out housing and amenities, and they create a questionnaire. So it's, if you look at what the census does, they have one part which is describing amenities, assets of households, and so on, right? So, for example, do you own a car? Do you own a mobile phone, etc.? So these are called the asset side stuff. That is one part of it, right? And then they aggregate that at the village and town level, right? So you get something called as a town and village directory, which is mentioned here. But the main part of the census is a one-page questionnaire with side A and side B, right? And that is administered in February. Typically, the reference date is February for all the censuses. And that looks something like this, right? So when we say, what data does the census collect, or what data does any source collect, the first point for any researcher is the questionnaire, right? And you look at the census questionnaire, it's very smart today. It's very nicely barcoded and so on. And you'll see that each row out here is referring to a particular person in the household. So the census is going to a household, and so if there are many people, they will kind of write the names. So each person in the household is one of these blocks. And then relationship with the head. So if you've ever done surveys, this is very obvious to you. I think most of you. I won't take too much time on this, but you'll see that it collects data on gender, date of birth, and age, which is very important because you get age-specific data. Marital status, religion. You have data on caste, but only scheduled caste, scheduled tribe. No other data on caste is available from the Census of India. India did try a socioeconomic caste census, SECC, but that data is all over the place. It's very controversial. But the Census of India per se has not released any caste data since 1931. So that's the last authentic caste data that you get at the district level. And then you have literacy rates, literacy status, attendance, higher education, and so on. And this is side B. So that's it. Census is really simple because it's just got two sides, right? And you might think, how on earth is this important for my research? Suppose I'm looking at innovation in India, right? Which parts of India are more innovative? I would say this questionnaire still matters, even though it doesn't have a question on innovation, because it will help your research by developing what we call as explanatory variables, right? So for innovation, a great variable to be would be simply urbanization and literacy rate. And so you want to know the urbanization rate and literacy rate ideally at the district level, or even at the micro level, sub-district level across India, right? And that would help this research question of yours saying which parts of India are more innovative, and that would basically come from a questionnaire like this, right? And so it also has some questions on migration, question on fertility, questions of occupation, right? So if you look at what it's covering the basic structure of the household. That's what it's doing. But there's another side of it, which is on the amenities side, which is very useful. It captures assets. And most importantly, it's releasing this data at these micro spatial units, not individual household, but mostly at the district. Now, the census can make errors. Is the census completely devoid of errors? No. And actually, last year I pointed out one major error. So the migration data was released very late. But if you believe the migration data of the census 2011, it basically showed that a lot of Ugandans seem to be migrating to India. And it almost most certainly was a coding error at the census official level. So I raised this point, and I think the Census of India has withdrawn that data as of now and are sort of looking at it. So that's the first point, and this thing on the right, that is always run basic checks on data. Never take your data, even if it is from the Census of India, which by the way has fantastic credibility in terms of data quality and data collection, but still there might be mistakes. So simple things, male plus female plus other should equal to total people in that particular district. Or total of districts should equal to total of states. Total of states should equal all India totals. These are basic checks that one does when one gets census data, or for that matter, any data set. Okay, so this is what the census gives us today. I'm going to, I've already talked about the first part. The primary census abstract is very important. It's called the PCA. Why is it important? It gives you very simple data. It gives you total population, male, female, how many people are literate, age group 0 to 6. It gives you occupation, about 5 or 6 categories. It gives you SC and ST. But it's very important because the primary census abstract is released at the village and town and ward level, which means you have it at a very micro spatial unit. You can know in each village of India what is the literacy rate thanks to the plan. And that is great as researchers because that's about 500,000 data points that you get. Right? So you have this variation of 500,000 villages on literacy rate, on child sex ratios, you can compute fertility measures at the village level or the town level or the ward level because of the primary census abstract. The other reason why the primary census abstract is fantastic is because it's the first thing that's released by the census. Note, all this data that's being shown, Census 2011 was when it collected the data, but the data is released to the public very late. Right? And in fact, on migration research, some of it has still not been released, after 9 years, and it was majorly released only last year. So 8 years after the census, and that's a major problem with the census, that we are getting the data very late. But the primary census abstract comes out the first thing. Right? So within 1 year, you have the primary census abstract, first provisional and then final. And so that's a very useful data to work. And you can do a lot actually just by the primary census abstract. Okay, and then you have data, for example, on social cultural tables, age, religion, and so on. But you can't get data in India on, say, religion at the village level. So if you want to know what percentage of Hindus, Buddhists, Christian, Muslim at a village level, it is the Census of India will release that data only at the district. And that is what we mean by saying most data of the census is released at the district level. So if you go to the census website, most of the downloadable files, you will see the rows are basically districts, right? And the columns are the other things that you're interested in. Again, then it has on amenities, which is very useful. Now, this is what the census collects. And I'm going to talk about these, 3 other things out here, which I believe are super useful, right? And so researchers, many people in India actually are unaware that these things exist. First is the district census handbook. If you're doing qualitative research in India, if you're doing quantitative research in India, looking at spatial variation, you ought to know what is the district census handbook, and you should, I would say, go through one completely. The first part of the district census handbook is fantastic. It tells you the history of the district, and this is a long-standing process. The district census handbook there's a 100-year-old history to the production of this document, right? And so it's a very nice sort of compendium of that particular district, and we'll talk more about districts in a bit. But this tells you fantastic information, and the district census handbook, believe it or not, gives you comparable data for that district going back 100 years on a few indicators, very few, like population of a district in 2011, what was it in 1901, the district census handbook will tell you that. Right? And so it's a fantastic source to basically compute simple things like population growth rates of a city, for example. You want to know which cities of India are growing faster, or whether Pune grew faster than Jaipur. You can do that from 1901 to 2011, just by going to the census website. This is very useful, the primary census abstract and the village and town directory. So for each village in India, you can find out, for example, the number of sort of health centers, the number of schools, and so on. And this is also what the census does. This the census does by a listing at the unit level, that is village or the town level. And so this is not by going to the household. This is by counting everything in that particular spatial unit. And so a lot of researchers use this to identify which towns or which villages in India are doing better than others. And then you have occasional census special study. And this is probably the most unknown aspect of the census. That is, from time to time, the Census of India becomes a researcher, goes into the field and collects phenomenal data, which it publishes as reports, maybe not as spreadsheets, but reports, and which can be terribly useful. And I'm going to show you a study later on which uses this to design a particular research study very productively. And it's very, very important, especially for sociologists and anthropologists, to know about the village and town study monographs, which were published pretty much between the 1960s and 1980s. They've kind of discontinued it now, but it's a phenomenal source of information. How do you get census data? So before I start coming on, or giving examples of how to use this data, it's today all the census data from 1991 to now, whatever has been released, you don't need to digitize it in terms of copy pasting from PDF to Excel. All the Excel tables, to the best of my knowledge, are online. Okay? And this is the link, right? So if you go to this link, you will find all the census data available in tables. Typically, for example, migration, they will give you a series, there were 35 states and union territories. You will have to download 35 Excel files. That's what it is. And then you will have to collate those 35 files to get an all India district level migration data on certain indicators. Now, there'll be another question on migration and education. They'll have a cross tab. That will be a particular number like D3. So D is the migration series. So D3, suppose, is something on migration. You will have to download those 35. So the process of collecting census information is to continuously download 35 or 36 state level files to collate a district level database on a variety of indicators in India. Okay? Now, what do we do for before 1951? Remarkably, all this is also now available at your fingertips, right? So it's all digitized. It's available at the IIPS library in Mumbai, which is a demography institute. But a lot of it is now available on archive.org, freely available on Gokhale Institute, in Pune, the space of that. And the format before 1951. So if you go to the census website today, it's basically a number like D1, A1 of a table, and you download files of that. Earlier, of course, this is not in spreadsheet form, which means you have to do some effort, though many researchers have digitized a lot of this. You have to take some effort in converting that PDF into Excel, right? And there are a lot of softwares to do this nowadays, or you could outsource it to a data entry operator. But the way those reports were published is they had part one called the report, where the census would very nicely describe the data. It's actually a practice which has been forgotten by the census now. Today, they just give you tables. They don't describe that data. But the colonial officers actually described the data in their interpretation. And then a part two where were the tables, right? So if you want to collect a district level database of literacy rates, suppose in 1901, you would have to first go to say the province, you would find the province of Bombay Presidency. In that, the part two tables will give you the districts of Bombay, and it would give you the literacy numbers, the total population. You take a division, you'll get literacy rate of all the districts in Bombay Presidency. Then you would have to open the file of Madras Presidency, which would give you in part two all the tables. It would give you literacy, and hence out there you will basically download, or you would convert those files into Excel and get all the districts of the Madras Presidency and literacy. So then you add up Madras Presidency, Bombay Presidency, and all the others, and you would get, roughly there were about 200 odd districts back then. So about 200 districts literacy rates in 1901. Okay, this is how it would look. So this is, for example, the 1901 census report. This is how it would look. Okay, and this is just giving you all the spatial units of that time, right? So you had Ajmer, Merwara was one place, Assam was one province, Bengal, Calcutta city within that, Burma, as I mentioned, Coorg as a separate unit, Madras, Punjab. So these are a variety of documents which have survived and which are very useful for researchers. Now, a lot of this, as I mentioned, is online. A lot of this is also available on the census website, but it's hidden. It's literally hidden. And so you need to search the document's name, and it will take you to this, lsi.gov.in. So if you click on this, it will take you to a sort of hidden library in the census website. It doesn't give all the census documents of all times, but it gives a lot of them, and it's nicely digitized. It's OCR scanned, so you can read. You can copy paste from the PDF itself. But the actual list is much larger. As I mentioned, it's also available on archive.org and so on. But this is great. Why is this great? It's great to access the census monographs, and the census monographs are very useful for a variety of reasons. Now, if you want to know more about the census, I'm just going to leave this slide. Everything published before the 1970s is nicely catalogued in two bibliographies, right? So there's one bibliography by the census and one by Divekar, and the Divekar's one is easily available on this link. If you click on this link, you'll basically get a nice bibliography of everything written by the census officials until the 1970s, and that's a real treasure trove. 1981, there was a book on the census. It's important to know how the census used to be run and so on. And Sumit Goaz has a great paper in 2003, which looks at about, the census, while it collects information, it also actually creates new identities. And so this is also a critique of the census. That is, when you collect information, are you inscribing new identities on people? And the census, of course, while we say is a great resource for administration, a great resource for research, the critique also is that it gives too much information. And so most famously, of course, the partition of India, for example, used census data, right? The partition of the lines drawn during partition were based on religion data taken from the census of 1941, census of 1931, and that's how the partition lines were drawn. And we know this is very traumatic. Now, arguably, if the census was not there, we don't know if the partition would have happened the way it happened, but we do know that the census data enabled the partition of the country on religious lines, and that's the reason why we got those lines in the first place, right? So there's always this sort of trade-off between collecting information and the downsides of collecting that information. But on balance, I am completely pro-census. That is, I think the census does provide a lot of valuable information. To give you an example, per capita income, how would you know that if you didn't know the population of the country? And the per capita income is used in India for fiscal transfers. How much money Bihar gets from Delhi, in terms of the fiscal federal framework, a lot of it is based on population size, right? And so that is, where's that data coming from? It's coming from the census. Urbanization rates in India, where's the data coming from? It's coming from the census. Fertility rates in India, a lot of it is coming from the census. Literacy, education from the census. So it is still a very, very important part of data collection. Some more resources on the census. This is a website I maintain on a link. And if you go there, you'll find a variety of digital databases where you can find old census data, journals which have used census data of India, archives, bibliographies, and so on. So this is a one-stop resource. Sam Asher and Paul Novosad have this terrific database. If you go on this website called Dev Data, so what do? They find if you want to do data using, if you want to do analysis using census data of the last 25 years, your first stop should now not only be the census website, but you should go to Sam and Paul's great web link, where they not only give you all the information of the census, but they give you the geographic identifiers so that you can link data across. And so the big question is, how do we analyze census data? Because we're not getting at the individual or the household level. So what we can do is basically district level studies or village or town level studies. Right? And most data, as I said, was disseminated at the district level. So the question is, how do we understand districts in India? Because we started off with about 200 odd districts in the colonial era. And today we have more than 700 districts in India. So if I want to know the literacy rate of a district which is there today, what was it the literacy rate 50 years back? I can't really answer that question unless I have the same spatial unit. So a big challenge, and one of the reasons people hesitate to do census-based long time kind of series analysis is that people are completely clueless as to how do we sort of move to the district level and understand these changes of district boundaries over time. And you should know that if you're working with census, you ought to be working with district data. Right? State level, there are about 30, 35 odd states. That's a very small sample. Right? So any researcher will tell you, if you're using data sets, quantitative data, you want a reasonable sample, at least more than 100 and so on, especially over time. Right? And so districts of India are fantastic because there are hundreds of districts of India. States are just too few in number. And so while you can sort of get basic idea at the state level, you really ought to be working at district level. So what's the best way to understand district? I'm going to tell you a magic book on this, and this is that book. Right? So if there's one takeaway from this workshop, it's to go to this website, which is written down here, and basically download this book. If you're a researcher of the social science in India, you have to have this book. Right? It's as simple as that. And what it gives you is a fantastic, it gives you tons and tons of maps of India, very precise maps, by the way. And it's very, very valuable in understanding changes over time. Most famously, the table of contents will tell you that it gives you the map of India, not only today, but in every census period till date. And this is a dream resource for researchers because you can now compare districts over time by looking at, which this district, say Ratnagiri, what was it in the past? And you can look at how the district borders have changed over time. Okay. So this is how India looked in 1901. And this is very important to know as researchers. For example, not all of India was ruled directly by the British. The pink spots are the British. The yellow spots are the princely ruled states of India. So you'll see the big ones, Jammu and Kashmir, Rajasthan, Hyderabad, Mysore, this Travancore, Kochi, and then Central India states. And you'll see these numbers. And the census, this particular book basically gives you a list, it gives you a code. So you can see, so for example, this number 1 out here in what we would call as Bihar now, it's a particular district in Bihar and it's coded in the book in a particular way, right? So this is how India, the administrative boundaries of India looked in 1901. Now here's the thing, if you wanted to find the spatial variation of literacy rates in India in 1901, you can do that, but it would have to be in the boundaries of what you see in this map, right? So that is how that map would look. If you wanted to put a district level map of India in 1901 on, caste, and you had, a lot of data on religion, caste, and so on. This is how India looked in 1951, right? And you see it's broadly similar. Even after independence, India looked broadly as how it was in the colonial period. The big change, of course, as you know, happened in 1956 with the linguistic reorganization of states in India, where states took sort of linguistic dimensions, and that's when the maps of India dramatically changed, right? And so this is what we get in 2011, the one on the left, and they're saying 2011 there were 640 districts, so 640 districts on this map. And it's a great book because the book comes at a very high resolution, so you can actually zoom into the districts and see which district it is, right? It's a very nice thing to do. Now, you will see that this book also gives you this map of the changes in district borders, right? And this is phenomenal because now you know exactly where the districts were splintered, how the districts were bifurcated, carved out, etc. to make your, and that if you want to do a long-term analysis using census data, this is a fantastic resource, right? It in one snapshot tells you in which decade some of these changes happen. Okay. You can go one step further thanks to the work of Kumar and Somanathan at the Delhi School of Economics. They have a working paper, you can download it. This is the link. And they basically provide a simple table of, this is just a table, but they do much more, of how many districts were there in each state of India. And so the number of districts in India rose from 339 in 1961 to about 700 plus. But the operative numbers are 593 in 2001, 640 in 2005. Right? This is great. Why? Because you have more than 500 districts. Now you can do a lot of things like say panel data analysis, right? So you can create indicators for 1991, 2001, 2011 on a variety of indicators at the district level for roughly about 450 districts of India. You would have to backcast today's data into larger district boundaries which existed back then. How do you do that? That's the big challenge, and that's sort of given to us by Kumar and Somanathan. So this is a very important paper that you should definitely have in your toolkit to analyze census data. And so I mentioned one, the book, the Administrative Atlas of India, you have to download that. And the second part is this particular working paper. Why? Because it provides a concordance table. Right? So now you know how to backcast. Somebody has done this hard work for you. You know now how to backcast the data to create long-term time series of the census. This is very powerful, right? Because you get all India data on a variety of variables, even for example, labor force participation rates going back in time substantially. There are some more sort of papers and stuff written on districts. There's one by Saurav on formation of new administrative units. What does it do for development? This district creation in India is quite a craze. And one of my first papers was actually on this topic because I was obsessed about districts during my PhD. And I wrote this small article called Small States, Small Districts, or Small Blocks. Right? And so this is also another piece. So if you're interested in administrative units, and because this is very important, if you're doing any work, even using NSS, you need to know how India's district level map looks like. So let's try. Now you have some background information on the census. You have some information on, when the census was created, the maps of India and so on. And I showed you this chart up front. So now suppose I throw the question to you. As suppose you're a student and I say, draw me this chart. That is, go and figure out the sex ratio from 1901 to 2011 of Azamgarh district in Uttar Pradesh. Now, how would you do this? Right? Now, when you look at sex ratio, basically you're looking for the total male population, total female population. So what you would do is basically then look at what is available for that district, right? And see if it can be aggregated over time when district boundaries change. So Azamgarh's district boundaries must have changed over time, right? So let's take the case of Ratnagiri here. Start with Ratnagiri district ratio in 2011. So this is the simplest. You can always take Ratnagiri's district ratio in 2011. How do you do that? You would go to the census website, download the primary census abstract for Maharashtra. It would give you the primary census abstract of Ratnagiri, and that would give you total number of males and total number of females in Ratnagiri, and that would give you the sex ratio to 2011. Right? But now the core idea is this: if Ratnagiri's boundaries had not changed all the way back to 1901, then it's very simple. You just go to each census back and then create this one sort of indicator. But Ratnagiri boundaries do change, right? And it was bifurcated only once. So in the case of Ratnagiri, it just happened once. It was called Ratnagiri as a big part of the Konkan, and it got bifurcated into Ratnagiri and Sindhudurg in roughly the 1980s. Right? So what we call Ratnagiri today is only about half of what we call Ratnagiri in 1901. So if you're looking at the 1901 Ratnagiri sex ratio, it is not the same as the sex ratio of Ratnagiri today because that Ratnagiri included Sindhudurg. Right? So what we want to do is cull out only the Ratnagiri part of today from the Ratnagiri of the past. For that, you have to go back to the 1901 census tables for the Bombay Presidency where the district was. And believe it or not, for male-female population, you can get data even back then at a village and town level. So you can aggregate for only those blocks and get the corresponding sort of sex ratio for what is Ratnagiri sex ratio back then. And you can do that similarly for others. Now, thankfully, this point number 6 out here is important. You don't need to do this in the case of sex ratio. Why? Because the Census of India has already done this, and where have they kept this? They've kept this in the district census handbook. So actually, if you just open the district census handbook of Azamgarh, you'll be surprised to know you can actually trace out the identical sex ratio time series, right, for Azamgarh from 1901 to now. Very simple, just open the district census handbook. Right? You can also do this for certain or very few indicators. But if you want more indicators, you want to know literacy, you want to know other indicators which are not given in the district census handbook since 1901, this is this 6 or 7 point process that you would have to follow. Let's try again. You want to show how India's migration rate, for example, hypothetical, changes over 40 years. So this is a very simple time series at the all India level, 1971, 1981, and so on till date. How would you do that? You would first go to the census website, find out where migration is. It's in the D series. You would collate data from 1971. Each census, you would go to the D series. You would find the total number of migrants, total number of the total population, take that ratio, and then plot it like this, right? But as researchers, we have to be very sensitive that what was defined as a migrant or who was defined as a migrant in 2011 might be very different from 1971. That is why whenever we work with any data set, but especially census NSS, going back over time, the footnotes of the table are very important. Right? So this is not a complete figure that I've shown you. Ideally, there should be notes to this particular chart. And that note should say that, look, I'm showing you data for 1981, 1991, but technically the data for Assam and Jammu and Kashmir is not there. So technically it's not strictly comparable. I can make it comparable if I drop Assam and Jammu and Kashmir from all the other time periods, and I can just call it, India X Assam and Jammu and Kashmir migration rates. Now that would be perfectly comparable. The second thing I should be aware of as a researcher is the definition. And so you should look at the definition of that indicator in every period to see the definition is changing. So these are the two checks you have to make before drawing a simple time series like this. Now, how do you generate something like this, right? So this is from my urban growth project. I have it's called Urbanization, Demographic Transition, and the Growth of Cities in India, 1870 to 2020. You can Google it up and find this paper. The chart on the left shows you the map of India today, but it shows you the population data for cities in 1901, right? So I have drawn these dots on the map, scaled by bubble size, right, to sort of reflect how big the cities were, okay? And it's trying to show you how large cities have grown over 110 years. It's very powerful as a visual medium, though of course nothing like the map that you're seeing in 1901 existed back then. It says 1901 in the boundaries of 2001. And what this will show is, of course, that a lot of cities in the north were fairly populous in relative terms back then, and they kind of fell out there. Right? And you see these three big clusters, Bangalore, Madras, and Hyderabad pop up. Right? So what am I doing here? How does one generate these maps? I went back to the 1901 database. I looked at the towns and cities. I looked at the towns and cities today, but I have to be careful that the areas of those places have changed. To the best extent possible, I sort of aggregate the villages around those towns and make it comparable in time, or I leave it as it is and have a note at the bottom of the table saying it's not exactly comparable, but this is for sort of illustrative purposes. I then look at the 2011 census. That's simple. That's in a spreadsheet. I just download that database and input that for every city. But for 1901, I need to go back to the PDF, collect or collate the data out from the particular PDF file into Excel. And then at the end, I have two columns in Excel, one for 1901, one for 2011. Now, again, actually, this is more for recheck because believe it or not, the census actually gives data for every urban agglomeration city of India, its population backcasted from 1901 to now. So this is also one of those hidden things of the census. You can have the population of every urban unit in India in the village, in the town directory files, or sometimes in the district census handbook, if I'm not mistaken, going back to 1901. Okay, that's a tremendous thing. If you're working on urban studies, that's a tremendous source. Now, the big question, of course, is all these pretty, looking maps. is if you know how to map. And how do you map? So this is not a workshop on mapping. So I've just got this one slide to tell you how to go about it. You need to get a software called QGIS. It's free, it's open source. And what you need then is to basically look up online and learn. It's very simple. You know, I learned it. I used to use a different software when I was in my PhD 10 years back. But QGIS is very simple. You will get district level files of India online. You know, you just have to search hard enough. They will end with .shp. You need to drag and drop the district level .shp file of India into QGIS, and you will see that district level map. Each district is then connected to a spreadsheet. So if you have a spreadsheet of districts as rows with, say, indicators like literacy, population growth, or whatever, you just have to link that Excel sheet to this .shp file, and voila, you can see it on the map. You can do the color coding. You can do a lot of magic in terms of visual presentation, right? So that's a broad process, but this is more of a self-learning process for you. I've given you the software that you ought to go to, and also the kind of files that you need to go to. Okay, so how is the census used? So of course, demographers have used it in a variety of ways. The population of India and Pakistan was probably the first great book written by a social science researcher, Kingsley Davis, in 1951. I still think that all social science researchers of India should read it, because it tells you all about India. How is India? Though it's dated, it's a fantastic book. Tim Dyson has done a lot to understand Indian demography. One of the most cited papers in Indian social science, more than 2,000 research citations, was used pretty much using district level census data on such stuff like female labor force participation, child sex ratios. It's a fantastic paper in the Population Development Review. Again, a highly recommended paper to read if you want to understand variation in India across space. Tim Dyson now has 2 books on historical demography, and I'm pointing out these books because they'll use a lot of census data to make an argument, right? And if you really want to get into demography, the best place for that is IIPS in Mumbai, and it's probably the best single site resource for all the demographic research that's ever been done, using census data. So that's the place you want to be. I spend a lot of time during my research days at the IIPS library. And note, you can get a lot of data freely on like your hard drive or CD by requesting them. You can get census data, NSS data, all those, I told you all those historical data. If you go to IIPS with a request form, you can access the data. So it's a fantastic institution that you should definitely check out. Now, how are economists using it, right? This has been a huge growth area for economists and economic historians over the past 10, 15 years. What researchers are looking out for is, of course, interesting variations, studies on persistence over time. So classic question, did the landlord system that the British introduced have enduring impacts in India afterwards, right? So there have been papers written on this. Did the taxation structure of India at the district level affect state capacity in post-independence? Aditya Dar has worked on irrigation canals. Did irrigation canals set up in British India, influence development outcomes in post-independence? Right? So there are very fascinating research questions people are asking, which are very, very useful for economists, public policy students, and so on. And of course, the method out here is the statistical regression, which people using qualitative research, probably are not, going to veer towards. And in the second part, we're going to talk more about qualitative research. Historical data is also now used a lot as natural experiments, right? As something interesting, a shock which happened, the influenza pandemic of 1918, which killed so many Indians. And in economics, of course, as a method of regression, the instrumental variables method of having an instrument in your regression, historical variables are very important out there. So a lot of researchers are now mining historical data to find relevant indicators which can explain causal relationships, plausibly causal relationships today by using a variable in the past. And I'll give you some examples from that. But a lot of the leading economics journals now have papers like this. And if you want to look at more examples, just search for India in journals like the Journal of Economic History or Economic History. Okay, to give you an example from my own research, I've been working on migration. I showed you this chart on the right, which is out migration of India in 2007-8. It turns out that a lot of districts of India, like I showed you Ratnagiri, did have mass male out migration even 100 years back. And so I have a paper called The Missing Men, Migration and Labor Markets in the Journal of Labor Economics, which uses an historical variable as an instrument for current out migration, argument being that it's not related with the outcome variables today. Right? But what is that variable I use? I use the variable of an adjusted sex ratio in 1901. Right? Now, this is a map of India today on the left, but I've put the data of today's districts of sex ratio as it was in 1901. Right? And you'll see, of course, this is not ideal because, of course, it covers both out-migration as well as sex-selective gender discrimination. But when you do region-adjusted sex ratios, you'll see that Ratnagiri, for example, has this really elevated sex ratio back then, and Ratnagiri has this massive out-migration. Right? And you'll see very similar visual correlations in eastern UP, Bihar, then out here, in coastal Orissa back then, out here, in coastal Tamil Nadu, out there, now here, and so on. Right? So many of the major regions of out-migration today correspond to region-adjusted sex ratios in the past. So I have a paper which uses, of course, NSS data as the outcome variable, okay? NSS and census data in the outcome variables, but I have historical census data at the district level in the independent variable side, right? So this is one way of doing quantitative research using historical data. Note, I didn't even have to go to history. Even the contemporary data was coming a lot from the census. The key out here was district as the unit of analysis because it gives you a lot of sample size. A lot of interesting other work. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. There's Latika Chaudhary's work. If you've not looked at it, do look at it. Anybody working on education has to look at it. And it looks at the provision of education at the district level in early 20th century. What she did was digitize a huge amount of district level data on literacy back then. And now what she's doing is looking at today's development indicators and see how it correlates with some of those indicators that she generated in the past. And so she has this very interesting paper co-authored, which looks at luminosity, which is a sort of a proxy for development at the micro level today, with, for example, missionary educational service provision in the early 20th century. Right? And so this is interesting ways in which people are looking at the persistence of historic shocks with contemporary sort of outcomes. There's also work, so you're working on public health, very similar work on hospitals and healthcare in early 20th century India and its persistent effects over time and how it is affecting healthcare provision even today. So education and health, if you're working on these two areas, there is now substantial work connecting history and the present using census data. A great work by, again, Sam and Paul looking at the village level is looking at rural roads. So do roads, this massive road Gram Sadak Yojana, which was implemented. So this is of interest to public policy students. I would say this is the paper to read if you're a public policy student, to know in this case the limited effectiveness of a massive public policy scheme on development indicators, right? And this is, again, it's using the data on villages, and a lot of the data is coming from census. There are really a lot of others which I can go on in the Q&A section. A bit on census and sociologists. If you look at India's 5 core identities, which every social science research in India has or will engage at some point, which is class, language, religion, caste, and gender, the census gives you good information on 4 of them, not all. Right? It does not really give you information on class because the Census of India does not give you information on income or consumption, which is what the NSS or National Sample Service does to a certain extent. But what the census does give you is some information on assets. So you can do some stuff with the census on class, but not too much. There's a lot on gender because almost everything in the census is given at the male-female level. You can do stuff on caste at the SC/ST level, and a lot of it is now increasingly being disseminated very micro level. Right? But there are some quirks in the data. For example, there are no scheduled tribes found in Delhi, for example, simply because Delhi does not have a scheduled tribe list. So there are some very important quirks in the caste and tribe data in the census that one should be aware of. But you can, of course, always work with census data of the past. And so 1931 being the last caste census data, you can always look up the 1931 census to know, you want to know what is the distribution of a particular caste in India in space, you can map it out for 1931. Right? Religion has, of course, been there right from the first census, and so has language being probably the least used of the data. Now, for sociologists, of course, this is a gold mine, and most sociologists, of course, do a lot of field work, but you must complement that field work of that region that you're studying with the data that the census is providing, right? So how different is your sample or your case from the socioeconomic demographics that the Census of India has? Let me give an example of what I did. I was doing fieldwork in Surat. I did a lot of work on the railway stations out there. I had not only the NSS sample, but the census sample for Surat, and I would compare what I was seeing in my data with what the census is providing me for Surat. Right? And so you can check, even if you're doing field work, you can check your own data with how much of a variance it is with the census. You could also make an argument that the census is not picking up important things. Like many of us in migration have argued that census is not the best way to understand migration. Okay. Give an example of what Kalyani Vartak's research at TISS Mumbai. I was on a PhD committee. Fantastic research completed last year. And a classic example of how one uses unexplored census data to do excellent field work. Okay, so what we found was this. We found that one of the least explored sort of data sources in the census are the census village and town monographs, right? And this is now all digitized, by the way, and all freely available online. At the time we were doing our research, this was not. So this is how the cover of that monograph would look. So this is Kunkeri village survey monograph, and it's like a 140-page document describing this village in terrific detail, including, for example, caste and asset ownership data in terms of, I mean, this is just a simple table of contents, but it gives you tremendous detail, which the tables otherwise does not give. This is think of it as a special statistical come ethnographic work that the census did on certain villages of India. They covered about 300 odd villages and towns of India in these few decades. Now, what Kalyani did was, because she knew that Kunkeri was studied in 1961, she knew Kunkeri was studied in 1980s. Again, there was a restudy of this Kunkeri village in 1980s. She went back in 2017-18 and she did a census herself. Right? So here's a really cool way to do fieldwork, is to actually pick a village which the census had studied in great detail, provided these excellent monographs in the 60s and 80s, and go back to that same village, what we call as village resurvey studies. Right? This is just a photograph of Kalyani, with one of her respondents in the region, and eventually she came out with a great PhD thesis last year. A variety of papers which have come out of that. Some of it is co-authored with me and Amitabh Hide, one on migration and caste, for example. But the point out here is to show you that the census is not just tables online. Census is so rich that there are multiple possibilities of engaging with it, right? And you need to understand what it provides. You need to go through that atlas. You need to go through the district census handbook of some district which you are studying. And if you're doing field work, definitely engage your sample with what the census is telling you. Okay, my own work on merchant migrations, for example, looks at how Marwadis have been migrating across time. Turns out that there is information on Marwadis in the census. This is a hand sketch, a terrible hand sketch on the left. It shows you, prevalence of Marwadis in 1901. This is literally me hand coding on an old sort of map. This was at a very early stage of research, but this is in 1961, where you see a lot of the Marwadis. I mean, typically you think of most Marwadis being in Calcutta. The bulk of the Marwadis happen to be in northern Maharashtra, this green region out here in India. This is Marwar, by the way, and this is the distribution of Marwadis across India. Now, what's the data source for this? It's the census, because the census does give you data on Marwadi as a language. You can see, for example, the spread of Gujarati as a language at the district level in India, and I've done that. I've not presented. This is how political scientists have used census data. Okay, this is a great paper by Aditya Dasgupta. It looks at the Green Revolution and the decline of single-party dominance. It was published in the American Political Science Review. Again, district-level data, using data from a variety of other sources. Agricultural data coming from the Agricultural Ministry and so on. Political data coming from the Election Commission and so on, but using census data as one of the independent variables. Right? So often we want to construct a district level database and use census data, if not in the outcome variable, in the independent variable side. Okay. There are, of course, other types of census. There's an agricultural census of India as well. Perhaps least known is something called as the economic census. Now note, this has nothing to do with the Census of India per se. Right? So it's a completely different census. But it does actually, in theory, enumerate all the establishments of India. It was done, I think, in 2005, it was done in 2015, I think in 1995, 1996. And management scholars in India, I think, have completely underused this data set. Again, it's like a 1 or 2 page questionnaire, not much data. But think about it, there are millions of enterprises enlisted out here. And so obviously smart researchers like Ashutosh Varshney, Lakshmi Tarun Khanna have this paper on EPW called Caste and Entrepreneurship in India, which uses data from the economic survey from these millions of enterprises of India very creatively. Again, I should note, It's nothing to do with the usual Census of India. It's a separate institutional mechanism. But this is also a data set, especially if you're a management student, you should get exposed to. Again, of course, languages is a hugely understudied database in the census. Okay, now what can't you get in the census? You can't get individual data. You can't get, you can't get income consumption data, and that is why we move on to the NSS. Okay, and I'm going to breeze through this NSS a bit. It's 3:15, so we have. I'm going to take about 5 or 10 minutes on this, and then open out for a 20-minute break. Okay, so the NSS, unlike the census, is a survey. It does not go to every household of India. It goes to a sample, and that sample today is about. I mean, I'm going to show you some numbers on how big they are. But it started in 1950. Again, one of the great things that Mahal Nobis gave us is this idea of doing good large-scale sample surveys. And in a way, it was the NSS of India which inspired similar work across the world. So it's also a pioneer in many ways for similar development survey work across the world. Again, you have a variety of surveys. You have household level surveys, enterprise surveys, village facilities, land and livestock. The first thing you need to do as a researcher in India is go to the NSS website and just look at what the NSS has captured since its first NSS survey till now. Right? And it will capture virtually everything that there can be researched. I can't think of a single topic that does not have some connection with some survey of the NSS. Okay, the more famous ones are the 5-yearly surveys, the consumption and employment surveys, right? And these are sort of given. They're very important to generate the poverty numbers, the labor force estimates, etc. And by the way, a lot of the data from the NSS feeds into the CSO. The NSS comes from the MOSPI, that is the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. The CSO is the Central Statistical Office, which comes out with the GDP data. So you'll agree that the GDP data is very important. A huge part of the GDP data comes from ratios generated from NSS surveys. So the NSS is very important as a building block to the GDP of India. Okay, and then there are cyclical surveys. For example, the migration surveys used to be done roughly every 7 or 8 years. This is not being done out here. And a great way to understand how NSS data works, the history of the NSS surveys is to go through back volumes of a journal called Survekshan. So this is the in-house journal of the National Sample Survey, and they're now trying to publicize the journal more. But I'm sure most decent libraries in India will have back volumes of Survekshan. And there's some fascinating, it's the who's who of India in statistics and economics have written articles and papers in this. So it also makes for a nice reading journal. Okay, it's at the household level, variety of topics, whereas the census is at the district level usually. And so that's the big difference between NSS and census that you can get at the household level. And just a ton of stuff which has been generated. The Great Indian Poverty Debate was on the NSS data. What is the correct calorie intake of the poverty line and so on. India's, 92% of India's informal. That statistics comes also from the NSS mostly. Is the public distribution system effective? Can you have, my former colleague Ritika Khera did a lot of work using NSS data to tap into how much of the consumption is coming from PDF and outside to estimate leakage. So as a public policy student, NSS is fantastic because a lot of the policy schemes are now captured in NSS questionnaires, and you can do a lot with that. My former colleague Vegard Iverson has this paper on how are jobs how do people get jobs in Indian cities, uses NSS data to answer this question. I used it, for example, to address this question on India's remittance economy. So for example, this is a map I generated on international remittance, and it came out, it was a great map because simply put, nobody knew where India's $70 billion international remittance economy was really going inside India. We know that about half of it goes into NRI deposits, but half of it goes directly into households. It turns out that the NSS 2007-8 was the first good survey in India which asked a question, do you get remittances? From that question, you can generate a variable called percentage of households in a district which receives international remittances. And I've basically put that on a map. Right? So this is again a district level map. Now you can see what I can do. I can now, with the district level map, say 593 districts of 2001, I can do a lot. I can combine, I can always aggregate NSS data at the district level and then add on stuff of the census. I can also compare for similar indicators how good or accurate is the NSS or the census, or what is the difference between the NSS and census by aggregating NSS data to the census, to the district level and comparing to what the census is. For example, age group distributions. A simple check of whether the NSS is telling a decent story or not is to look at age group distributions at the state level or the district level and compare it to the census. In theory, they should be pretty identical. Okay, so what is the sampling methodology? We say it's all India coverage. Some frontier districts are usually omitted. They're like these two completely different sampling frames for rural areas and urban. But here's the interesting thing. What is rural and what is urban? How does the NSS decide what is rural and urban? The NSS doesn't. They're relying on the census to do that. So a utility of the census is that actually, it really helps the NSS in setting the survey design. And virtually all that even individual private surveys do is take the census as the base for implementing the survey design. So the census is again very useful for subsequent surveys which ask more data. Typically, it's conducted throughout the year, so 4 sub-rounds within the year. This is important because we can say that while there's annual frequency on certain indicators, you also get quarterly indicators. You can do kind of a quarterly analysis of NSS on certain indicators if you want to, right? Because it does give you the identifier in the data on the time period. Again, there's something called a central and state sample. Typically, we analyze the central sample, first state unit, village, and urban frame sample. The sampling design is typically well specified in the report which comes out of each NSS survey. So let me give you an example. This is one which I've used extensively, the 64th round on migration 2007. So each NSS survey has a particular round, like the 64, 65, 66, and so on, and 2007. And typically each round referring to a particular year. And in each round, you might have 2 or 3 topics of interest. Just to give you an example, in the last few years, we've had a survey on education where you can study coaching classes, for example. Amazing questions on coaching classes. If you want to do a study on coaching class in India, you have a fantastic database on NSS. If you want to do studies on tourism in India, you have the NSS, right? Just a tremendous variety of sources of topics at the NSS. So what is the size? It's about 125,000 households. Right? Now that's a really tiny fraction of Indian households. There are about 20 crore households in India, of which only 125,000 households are being interviewed. But the whole idea being, using the power of statistics, that these households are sufficient to tell us a larger story. This is the broad split in rural and urban. And these 125,000 households, on an average, about 4.5 to 5 people per household on average, statistically speaking, you're getting information about nearly 600 or 6 lakh people, right? And if you look at state-wise, you're getting an average about 5,000 households per state, and you're getting on average about 200 households per district. Right? Now, this is very important because when you present district-level statistics of the NSS, you would want to do some robustness checks because this 200 households is pretty small. Right? And so typically there's this big divide in Indian academia on people who work with NSS only at the household level and people who think that you can use it at the district level and then combine it with many other statistics from other databases. And I belong to the latter camp, provided one does robustness checks at the district level. And you can do robustness checks on a variety of indicators to kind of find. So on migration, for example, I looked at other surveys which had used a larger sample size in Kerala, for example, and they were fairly accurate, both the NSS and those surveys. You can compare with the census on certain grounds. So to some extent, you can have an external validity check for the district level estimates generated by the NSS. Okay, so here's a typical questionnaire of the NSS. It will give you the broad things about which district, and this is key. The district identifier is very important, right? Now, why is the district identifier very important? Because you can often do an individual household level analysis in the NSS by importing data from the census using the district level identifier, right? Because the census gives us data on district. So for example, you want to know, how a household is doing in a high literacy region versus a low literacy region. You can, of course, compute the literacy rates at the district level through the NSS, but you could do better. You could import the data from the census of literacy rates at the district level, right? And basically then connect it with the NSS in your household level study. So multiple households at the same district will have the same value in the column for a particular literacy rate, but for every other district, you will have different values on literacy. So this is the most important variable in my view in the NSS, that is the district identifier, right? Then you have the classic household level demographics, right? So what is the occupation of the household, industry codes? You should know as researchers in India across the board what is NIC and NCO, right? So National Industrial Classification, National Classification of Occupation. Very, very, very important. Or I can imagine almost any research you do in India, you should know what is NIC, what is NCO. You should look up these manuals at least once in your life. Right? And you get to know the stunning variety of occupations and potential employment codes that exist in reality. Okay, then religion, social group, land possessed, very important. Again, some other stuff on migration, since it's a migration questionnaire. I'm going to skip on some of the other things. This is a very migration specific questionnaire, but this is just to give you a sense of how the questionnaire is done out. Okay, this is the last consumption page. Now, what is the limitation, right, of any survey, and especially the NSS survey, and why should one be very careful? One is, of course, respondent fatigue. The NSS surveys are fairly long, and there's some, if you look at the Sarvekshana reports, they're telling you that the NSS surveys are generating maybe slightly less accurate responses than in the past because of overload, right? So if the survey is very long, there's a trade-off. Questionnaire is very long, then people start getting tired by the end of it, give wrong answers and so on. Inaccurate data entry always possible, and just like in the census, do basic balance checks. There could be sampling errors. There could be undersampling of richer households in the NSS. That's one big critique of the NSS, that because the frames are revised less periodically, because of the way the sample selection is done, there seems to be some sort of an undersampling of relatively richer households. So that's one thing to note. And of course, entire households that are moved out from a place are not in the sample frame, and so that's a critique of any particular survey. So why is NSS often not used? One is that it looks very scary, right? So the basic answer is, if you go to a library, university library in India, or if you go online and get this data, you will basically get scared because the data looks very, very bad. And there's no generally easily available manual, though of course now there are some to basically convert this into usable form. So if you, for example, open an NSS data file, it would look like this on the left, right? An example of an NSS raw file. It would just give you a bunch of numbers. Right? But basically what those numbers are basically just columns. And so what you need in Stata, for example, which is a software, or you could use R, you need a particular conversion code to convert this file on your left into this file on your right. And you'll see that the first three letters are E4D, first three letters are your E4D. Basically, you're inserting column lines in this raw file to make it look like this, and this is very readable. This is telling you the columns, like this is round schedule 64th round, schedule 10.2, sample 1, district code 1, stratum code 1, and so on, right? And this same data, by the way, is here, right? So it's just making columns. Now, typically in Stata, we call them dictionary files. A lot of them, to the best of my knowledge, are now freely available online. The World Bank has done a massive job in providing this. So if you just Google these things out, you should be able to get this. I'm sure if people have been using this, you can list on the Q&A section what is the best way you've been going about. But the best part about the NSS data is that now you can just register on the MOSPI website and download the data, which means it's no longer a matter of privileged access to the NSS, which was how it was in the 1970s and 1990s. In the last decade, it has been completely democratized and you can get access. There is, of course, a larger question of the government releasing, not releasing the data and all in the first place. But once it's released, it's out there in the public domain and pretty much anybody can use, right? So once you get it in Stata or R or whatever the statistical software you're doing, then it's basically rows where each row is either an individual and household and columns, right? And then you do your basic tabulations and so on. So how do you work with unit level data? The first thing is read the questionnaire, and my tip would be to fill it up. Right? So any questionnaire which you're going to use the secondary data source for analysis, I always fill it up as if I was a respondent, because automatically you will get to know some of the questions, even though they're vetted well, which are very tough to actually figure out. Right? And so if you are finding it tough to fill up a questionnaire, think about the response. And so this is what I do whenever I see a question. I fill it up myself and see how is it as a respondent. The second thing is the NSS, for every round that they've conducted, publish an NSS migration report, read it fully. That is what you ought to do, right? So you don't have to go through each and every table, but read through all the chapters. Then you convert the raw data to usable columns, right? There are files which tell you to do this now available online. If I'm not mistaken, the World Bank also gives you Stata files directly. Understanding the meaning of multipliers and missing values. That is, just because there's something missing doesn't mean you drop that row. Missing values have important information. That is, those rows have important information. And multipliers are typically pasted in any survey data set, which basically talks about survey weights, right? So because the NSS is using a particular survey design, you need particular survey weights which are generated by the NSS, so you don't have to compute. And so you need to apply those survey designs to generate tabulations. So here's the simple idea, principle behind this. Suppose the NSS actually sampled 50% urban, 50% rural. Now that is not how India is. As per the census, India is about 70% rural, 30% urban. Right? But if the NSS gave you, if the NSS design was 50% urban, 50% rural, then the multipliers would basically give more weightage to the rural data than the urban data, so that when you actually calculate, for example, urbanization rate in India, the NSS simple tabulation will say 50%. Right? But you know that it's actually not 50%, it's only 30%. So what the NSS multipliers will do is will give more weightage to the rural value rows and get that number down from 50%. Right? Now, how do you understand multipliers and so on? Two great books for this, I'm not mentioned on the slide. One is Angus Deaton's, it's called Household Consumption Surveys or something like that. It's freely available online. It's almost like a World Bank document. The analysis of consumption surveys, I think that's broadly what it means, but that's a fantastic resource of Angus Deaton, which you must look at. The second, of course, is what the NSS documents themselves are saying. And if you're looking at sampling survey weights and so on, there's a book by, I think, Cochrane. Cochrane is the classic textbook on this, called Sampling Surveys. And so that will tell you the philosophy of this. Now, once you've done that, you should basically do simple reports. You should generate, for example, the classic is, what is the urbanization rate in the NSS sample, and compare that with what the NSS report is telling you. And then you begin your research. So this is the sort of quick check guide as to how you start with unit level data. And now this NSS data has been used across the board for a variety of things. Again, Sam Asher and all, they have recent work which look at NSS surveys to find out interoccupational, intergenerational mobility in India across sample surveys. And the reason I'm saying this is most people in India use NSS as cross-sectional data. That is, you use one NSS or you compute descriptive statistics of NSS for a particular round and then compare that. So classically, labor force participation rates of women or men in India from 1983 to now. So you have like these, benchmark 5-year employment surveys and you create a time series. That's a very accurate thing to do. But you could do more. You could also generate this at the district level for more recent rounds when it's possible, and create a district level panel of female labor force participants. Why? Because it gives you more rows and more columns. Right? That's the principle of any quantitative research. So the researchers now are doing very interesting work of household composition change, consumption changes, etc., investment changes, livestock, using not one NSS round, but 5 or 6 NSS rounds spanning 3 or 4 decades. So that's the sort of new age NSS research. You should also know that there are other large scale surveys outside the NSS, and so two again freely available data sets are the India Human Development Survey and the National Family Survey. Right? And so any social science research in India, I would imagine, has to be exposed to the census, to the NSS, to the IHTS, and to the NFHS. Right? And if you're really ambitious and want to do cross-country research, you should look at the Demographic Health Survey, which is nothing but the NFHS in some sense. But the DHS is standardized across countries. So you can ask, why is a particular district in India more healthy than others? Why is India less healthy than other countries? You can do that using survey level data using the DHS. So for that, you'll have to go to the DHS global website. So I'll end this first segment on just with some tips. The first is, of course, that when you use census or NSS data sets, there is no data set which is going to give you perfect one-on-one correlation in your key variables of interest, right? Which means it's going to be very messy. You don't get these perfect looking scatter plots or charts or tables anywhere in actual research. Now, a lot of researchers I find are not very honest about this and cover it up. Now, as a researcher, you know what you're doing best. And I believe, you have to be very honest in presenting to the reader, if you're showing a map or an article or a paper, all the flaws of not only your data, but of what you're presenting. That is, it's equally important to tell the reader what you're not showing up front. You don't want to fool the reader. You have to be as transparent as possible. Right? And so the first part is that you have to be very transparent with data. Many times we don't understand simply how the data generating process works. So one classic way of doing research is going online, picking tables and running regressions, or inserting a table somewhere in your thesis. I would highly recommend actually getting in touch, sending an email, picking up a phone, calling officials at the census and NSS, who, by the way, will respond most of the times, right? Or in that, they don't just land up at the office, as I've done many times, and ask questions as to how was this done, right? And so a lot of times you learn new things. I, for example, learned about this 1901 to 2011 data only at the census office in Bangalore. Right? Without that, there was simply no way I would have been able to tell you the sex ratio of the time series that I showed. So oftentimes you need to talk directly with the officials to understand the process. Now, the exciting part is, of course, that the next census is just around the corner, which means if you invest enough sort of attention on the census of 2011 and 2001, you have a great database at your resource. The minute the 2021 data comes, you could potentially be the first guy or a person who basically analyzes this data across 4 time periods, if not 6, if not 7, if you're very ambitious, even 10 or 15 censuses that is covering more than 100 years, right? But from 1991, everything is already in spreadsheet form on the website. So all you have to do is collate information at the district level, collate information, do the district concordance to aggregate districts and make it comparable. So you're going to compress the 700 plus districts of 2021 into roughly about 400 odd districts of 1991, and you'll have about 400 districts to play with, right, for 4 time periods, and you'll have what we call as a panel data set. Similarly, for NSS, look at questionnaires, especially questionnaires which are always available on the NSS website, and look at rounds which are happening as we speak, where the data has not been released. Because when the data is released, you will know what data is there because you've already looked at the questionnaire. And so, example, I wrote this paper during my PhD. I had not even finished my PhD, but I wrote this paper because I knew when I joined my PhD in 2008 that the NSS was doing a migration survey. I knew they would release the data at a certain time. I kept in touch with them. And when the data was out, I was probably the first person to purchase that data CD in those days and analyze this paper. And as it happens, it's the first paper to quantify India's remittance economy. Right? So if you're really passionate about a topic, you see it in the NSS, the data is not out there yet, you can still plan your research around it. If you're working as a social science researcher in India, and if you want to really explain all India kind of trends, you ought to know districts, right? And so there's a lot of fun things about districts. Of course, nobody can know 700 plus districts exactly, but this is a fun sort of thing which definitely you should do. If not for your research, I believe it also helps in your conversations. Oftentimes you meet people from different parts of India, different districts of India. It's impossible to know the village that a person is from, but when a person says you're from a certain district and you actually know about that district and you know something about that district, it's fantastic in conversation, and it's helped me tremendously in knowing people from across the country. And finally, next year in February, if the census is on track, I would highly recommend clicking a photograph with the census officials, because these guys do a tremendous job. And India has this unbeatable tradition of having uninterrupted censuses in most parts of India from 1872. Just to give you a comparison, Pakistan and Bangladesh do not have regular censuses like in India. Right? This is a real treasure resource in terms of statistics in India. And so, at least in 2011, when the census official came home, I was very excited about it, and I took a photograph. All right, so here's the break, and we're going to have now about 15 minutes of Q&A, 15, 20 minutes of Q&A. I'm just going to take a brief break. You can either, I think, ask or maybe put it in the chat box, and I'll be happy to take questions. This is a book I've written. This is some social media handles I run, and IIMA also does run a history internship. If you're interested, you can just Google it and find out more information. See if you can hear me. Okay. So Shivkumar says, would you be touching on colonial gazette reports of district collectors and official commissions which publish data on India? I have a very simple response to that. I've already given on the slides V.D. Divekar's Economic History of India, a bibliography. There are about, I think, 4 or 5 volumes. I have links to all those volumes on my website. It's all this was a person at the Gokhale Institute. Phenomenal work. And if you're doing historical research in India, you have to have that bibliography, because it gives you a list of virtually every gazetted report, every district census handbook, literally every government statistical publication published in India from roughly the early 19th century to the 1970s. Right? So the answer to Shiv Kumar Singh is, I am not touching up on colonial gazette reports, but my answer is, just go to V.D. Divekar's bibliography. It's the link to that is on my website, on history links on my website, and it's a phenomenal resource. It's just a nice one-place collection of all the gazetted reports. For those who don't know what are gazetted reports, phenomenal reports again on each district typically, which gives you a lot of information on the district. So if you're doing any work on a district, you ought to know the district census handbook. You ought to know the district gazetteer, which was compiled in the past. Sometimes the agricultural reports are also useful in the district. So that's the broad answer to that. Could you repeat the name of the software used to map the census at the district level? There is no automatic software which just takes it from the census and says. Basically, the census and says you need to compile in a spreadsheet where the district is the row, as simple as that. Right? Once you have a spreadsheet where the district is the row, the software is called QGIS. It's free, it's open source, it's very powerful. Right? You use QGIS, you download some shapefile maps of India at the district level, you link your spreadsheet which you have to that shapefile, and then you use QGIS to present it, and then you can do all the color coding. You can show districts with higher literacy, electricity, water, whatever you want. That's the broad process. That's the broad philosophy. Me and my colleague Sandeep, we do run a course in urban economics where we do teach GIS mapping and so on, but that's not part of this workshop. Okay, Rahul K. Kumar asks, is there any resource book, especially to understand the logic and methodology of NSS data? I would say the best way, there's no single book, but each report of each round is very valuable. So that's the first starting point. Go through the back volumes of Sarvekshana, phenomenal resource. I think when I was a PhD student more than 10 years back, I went through the back volumes of all the Sarvekshana reports. Terrific resource. You understand all the famous debates on the NSS data, the consumption, NAS, NSS consumption survey debates, labor definition debates. All of it is there in the Sarvekshana reports. But I would say if you're really understanding consumption, household surveys, Angus Deaton's book is fantastic. So Angus Deaton's book on consumption surveys, I think it's called Analysis in Developing Countries, something like that. It's fantastic, and it's freely available online. There's a World Bank publication. Okay, Prabal asks, do you know of any published works that have used literacy rate from the census as a proxy for voter rationality? I'm not an expert on political science. I'm pretty sure people must have used at some point, but I believe I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know how you would particularly define voter rationality. People would, of course, proxy literacy rates with a general level of awareness, for example. So awareness is really the indicator people are using literacy for. No, literacy rate has an upper bound, which is 100%. Right? So Kerala, for example, now it's almost there. But from now on, every decade, I mean, Bihar is just going to do better, so to speak, than Kerala, because Kerala is almost at 100%. Bihar is nowhere near 100%. So every census period from now, Bihar is coming closer to 100%. So as a metric, of course, any indicator which has an upper bound after a point is a bit useless. So what you want is ideally years of enrollment, which is average years of schooling or something like that, which the census does not quite give you. So it's easier to get that from the NSS. So that's my thing. But you would probably, I think, look at Aditya's paper, which I mentioned in the American Political Science Review. It uses a lot of census data as control variables, and that might be useful. Pallavi Singh asks, has census data been used for research in business history at the firm entrepreneur level? Can you guide me to a few, please? Yes, in the sense that if I'm not mistaken, Vishnupriya Gupta has done a lot of work on business history using firm level data. And if not directly, the census data is there at the back of the mind. Right? So comparing Bombay and Calcutta, you look at the caste composition of Bombay versus caste composition of Calcutta to know how cosmopolitan it is. But there are a lot of parts of the census which can be used for business history, which have not. So for example, the old censuses had very detailed, today, by the way, the occupational categories are very small. The occupational categories are just about 5 or 10. Back then, you had really detailed occupational categories, including one called managers. So if you look at the Census of India 1901 or 1931, you can find out how many managers were there, male, female, in every district of India. Now that's business history, right? And you can map out a managerial map of India in 1901 at the district level. That's the power of the census and business history. There are a lot of things which one can do. You can also look at, for example, number of people working in the cotton textile industry. Right? So that's a clear sort of indicator of industrialization. You can maybe combine that with jute and certain other industries. You can map out at the district level in 1901. So these are the ways I would imagine people would use census and business history. If you're looking for specific studies, between Latika Chaudhary, Vishnupriya Gupta, Tirthankar Roy, James Fenske, a lot of the leading economic historians of many business historians today, it covers a lot. But as I mentioned, even I've been looking at the language and caste data to understand the migration of business communities in India. So where were the Sindhis or Sindhi-speaking people in India before partition, for example? So there are a variety of ways one can actually address business history through the census. Okay, Biswajit says, could you please elaborate more on enumeration block level data from census? So you'll see that the census often gives some data, not all, okay, at the EB level, which is the census EB level. Unfortunately, the census, it's kind of useless for us. You can put it, in rows and so on, but it is useless because we can't see where they are. They don't give you a geographic identifier. We have ward level maps in India. Ideally, if you had EB level maps, you could do wonderful stuff in terms of spatial variation within cities, within villages, and so on. But the census, on most indicators, does not release that data. On most indicators, it does not provide the geographical identifier on that. Now, I know some researchers who have very smartly worked it out backwards and kind of, got it out. I don't know how exactly they do it, but I have seen some, studies using EB level data. In the economic census, however, enumeration block level data is very, very important, especially for management scholars, because you can look at a wide variety of enterprise survey data at a really micro spatial unit. Now, again, thoroughly underutilized. But again, the same problem. You can't put it on the map because you don't know where the EB is. All you can say is that these EBs are better off than those EBs, but you can't really put it on the map. That's the problem. So Abhishek asks, hi, it'd be great if you could give the second book's reference for understanding sampling weights. You mentioned Deaton's Analysis of Household Surveys, and then the other one. It is literally in my bookshelf. So this is the book. It's called Sampling Techniques by William Cochran. This is now slightly old. It's in the Wiley Student Edition, but this is what I would refer to for my sampling things. It's a very easy to understand sampling techniques book. It's not India specific. So this is about the general philosophy of sampling, right? So this is definitely a great book, understand sampling in India and Indus. I think between these two books, you get a lot about the philosophy of sampling and so on. And then you look at the survectional reports, you get really specific NSS, specific data. So that's what I would say. Would it be possible to enumerate data at a panchayat level from census? If there are any suggested methods of this? To the best of my knowledge, no. What you can do, what studies do is, collect data on panchayats from administrative data sets, download it from websites, scrape it off online. And then because you have village level information, it's kind of like the control variables, right? So you have percentage of scheduled castes in a village, you have that from the census, percentage of literacy, percentage of houses which have certain assets, all that is there in the census. But the core thing that you're looking at may not be at the panchayat level. Right? So typically studies, I think, on panchayats are doing this. They're using their own surveys, collecting data on panchayats or scraping data on panchayats online, and then because the village, the census data on village is used on the right-hand side. So it's on the sort of explanatory variable side. So I think that's how researchers are using it. Shireen asks, since caste data has been discontinued since 1941, actually 1931, what are the best ways to macro level caste data outside the census? I would say the India Human Development Survey is a reasonable start in the sense it does give you data on Brahmins, right? If not other castes, but if I'm not mistaken, the categories are Brahmins, forward castes, OBC, CST, and so on. The NSS does, by the way, give you OBC, right? So it's not Jati level. But to the best of my knowledge, it's the IHTS which gives you, some Jati. I mean, works on Jati level at the macro level. Typically, use the NCAR data. So it was called the REDS data set. So if you look up the data, the paper by Kevin Munshi and Rosenzweig in the American Economic Review on spatial allocation, disinformation, and so on in Indian rural labor markets, that uses Jati level data, all India, using the REDS NCR. So typically, researcher uses 1993-2007 panel of that to understand Jati level data. But it's not really there that much in the NFHS. So we are left with pretty much only 4 or 5 categories. What you could, of course, do is always, look at a village. I mean, let me give you an example of Kalyani's work. Simple thing like residential segregation by caste in a village, right? We had the map from the census in 1961. Kalyani did a census again 2 years back. And so you can compare how the village looks at the level of caste using Jati level data, because the monograph had the Jati level data in 1961, with what Kalyani was seeing almost 50 years later. So if not macro level studies, you can still push the census to tell you about Jatis even after 1931 in the village study monographs. And that's why I say, look at the village study monographs. In fact, this is an open research kind of, sort of, I'm just throwing it out there. There are about 300 village studies. Even if you don't go to those villages, absorb all the data from those villages, from those PDF reports, and compare it with the actual statistical reports that we have up till 2011, and you can tell remarkable stories for those 300 odd villages, I believe. So that's one thing waiting to be done. Shivkumar asked, is it possible to get urban ward data, socioeconomic surveys from census? To the best of my knowledge, there are papers now on segregation in India, in urban areas. So if you look at Gautam Band's work, if you look at others' work, that's using amenities. So you're getting amenities data. You get at the ward level, you're getting, I think, slum data as well. It's mostly in the town directory files that you get some information on wards. There are some other parts of the census I'm aware which does give you some information on wards. Not so much in the district census handbook, though again a bit. But the best bet would be to really, I think the best people who are working on this is this trio of at IIM Bangalore, which is Deepak Malgan, Andali Brahman, and Naveen. And they have a paper on residential segregation, which, if I'm not mistaken, uses data from some large sample study. I think it's the Karnataka census or the special census. But my answer to that would be, ask them what's the best way, because they have mapped out demography of Bangalore at a really neighborhood level, which I don't think has been done ever in any Indian city at such a scale. Right? So they have used some very interesting data for that. Sam Asher and Novasar team also have done this, by the way, at certain level. So they are the other people to reach out. But I'm not an expert on that. Sava Suel asks, how to go about when we're searching through historic journals and some are missing in between. No clear answer for that. You need to have a good library who will reach out to an interlibrary network and try and get that. That's the only way it's done. I'm blessed to have a fantastic library support out here. But you can always write to other libraries. Librarians are very, very helpful. That's my sense. Well, at least we have a terrifically friendly library. And so if you write and say, I really want this, you can maybe reach out and find from the library network. If a journal was published, and if it did have, it will be there somewhere. So it's missing. It's likely to be missing only in certain ends. I think that's what your question is. Is the housing and amenities data and census comparable with NSS data? Any round? You'll have to look at the definitions to know the exact comparison. But like mobile phone, does the household have a mobile phone or not? Right? A percentage of households who have a mobile phone in a particular district should be, in theory, comparable at the census and the NSS level. So at the district, yes, you can compare the NSS and the census anytime at the district. Any particular round, I'm not sort of, I can't say offhand, but my hunch is that it's possible. Right? So I will definitely not rule it out. I know I'm not fully answered the question, but I'll have to think more about it on which specific NSS round is comparable to housing amenities. Dhruv asks, the regression continuity design, is district level data enough, or do we have to go deeper to village level data? Not really. I mean, for regression continuity, see, I mean, ideally you want a policy discontinuity, right, for a good study. Regression discontinuity is, I mean, at the district level, the only thing that I can see is that, a crazy level of district redrawing, which, puts people now in a certainly new administrative exposure, and that you have something. So the only thing I can think of is new state creation or new district creation, right? So if you have a research question like new state creation, did it help the new states, or did new districts help the new districts? I think that is useful. But I think otherwise, RDD is, again, look at Sam Asher Novasad's paper. If I'm not mistaken, they look at RDD on the Gram Sadak Yojana and what it does, and they look at the village level, by the way. So that is, of course, of the allocation of those projects. That's where they get the RDD, this thing. But my sense is there are not too many studies which look at the district level for RDD. Raul says, my question is for new researchers not attended, what should be the learning? I mean, is there a book, journal, list of papers for NSSO data mix? So unfortunately, there is no such thing. There is, of course, tons of stuff you'll get on Quora, and if you just Google online, there should be lots. One of the reasons I'm doing this workshop and getting it recorded is so that a basic introduction to many of these issues is very clear to an audience. So this 3-hour session today will be online future. But feel free, if you have specific questions, feel free to write to me or interact with people who work on NSS data. I think it's a very helpful community. Earlier, like 20 years back, it was a very secretive enterprise. If you had the data, you were king or queen. Today, it's not the case. Everyone has access to data. So it's become more of a nice Creative Commons kind of a culture where everyone wants to be helping out each other. So like maps, I've deliberately not shown you maps, but you can find most of these shape files online today, or ask people to share it with you. So it's some of it is there's a nice sharing community of researchers across India. Let's put it that way, which can get you. Is it necessary to show sample size in ethnographic qualitative research? Then how? I'm not an expert on ethnography, but my sense is no, you don't need to show any sample size in qualitative research. But I think what qualitative research would call is saturation, right? So you want to attain saturation. So that could hopefully not with one, right? That would be ultimate saturation. But you want, my sense is there's really no number, right? If you want to press me for number, I would say something like 20 to 30, right? is the classic case if you're observing particular people. But I was observing this railway station in Surat during my PhD, and of course the strategy was whoever came next to me and sat at the general compartment ends, likely to be a migrant worker, would sort of speak to them. And after a point of time, of course, you get similar responses. And as a researcher, you just have to make a judgment call saying, okay, am I getting something new or not? And that's what you mean by saturation. But I'm not going to recommend a particular sample size per se. I think the whole beauty of qualitative research is to get away from the craze of sample size. There's a specific question on remittances, takes into account transfer for earning of India. So cross-border towns, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of data sets which do that. On remittances. On international remittances, there is one RBI survey of household level. You have the household level Excel sheets online. It's the most underutilized data on remittances, international remittances, in many of the leading places. But the RBI website actually has Excel sheets of a household level survey. Again, to the best of my knowledge, never used. Can you explain stratified sampling and survey weights and how to use it? Unfortunately, it will take too much time, and we are getting out of hand. So again, see the Deaton book, see the Cochrane book. They're the best sort of two sources that I have come across. I'm sure there are many more. Is there any database for Indian private shipping companies and their private? So not this question not related to this thing. So I'm going to take it offline. What are the caveats or loopholes one should be aware while analyzing NSSO data? Definitely sample sizes in the smaller ends, right? So if you're presenting a district level map of NSS, you will get a question in an Indian seminar of what is the reliability of this data, right? 200 households in a district, you're not going to get very good unbiased estimates at the district level. This is the most frequently asked question which I get in Indian seminar hall is, you're showing me a map of migration using NSS data, how do I trust it? And so I have a stock answer of 3 external validity tests which I've done to say that this data seems to be reliable. So that's the classic thing. District level estimates always questionable. But I think it's not just NSS. Any survey, you want to be aware of, is it really missing some households completely in its framework? I don't think the NSS is doing that. There's a huge criticism of NSS on consumption. There's this famous debate between the NAS. What the GDP side is collecting on consumption is something like a magnitude of a difference than what, if you just add up all the consumption NSS, it looks like there's hardly any consumption happening in India. But I think there's some papers which show, that why this divergence happened and so on. So that's one famous debate which criticizes NSS data. So that's one thing. If you're working on anything on consumption, look at the NAS-NSS consumption debate. And there are a lot of people looking at that. Can you mention some important source on agriculture-related historical data sets similar to the census? Absolutely. The starting point is, if I'm not mistaken, Sumit Guha's work and Blinn, right? These are classic works, district level or province level agricultural data from about the 1870s to 1930s. So that's there. Siva Subramaniam's National Income of India, that's a fantastic book which gives you annual time series of agriculture across crops across the 20th century. Every year you can say whether maize, jawar, bajra, what is the percentage growth. That's Siva Subramaniam's book for you. Again, my recommendation would be go through V.D. Divekar's bibliography. It's that is a phenomenal effort. It took, I think, 5 or 6 years to make that, it was a truly tremendous source. I'm just going to show you one. I'm going to share one link on the chat. Right, so I've just shared one link in the chat, and that's my website, History Links. So for the question on history, sources on history, I believe that website should exhaust a lot of your queries. But right at the bottom of the link is the links to the V.D. Divekar bibliography. Like I said, if there's some takeaways at the end of this workshop, that Census Atlas should be in your toolkit. That book, go to that website, download it right now. And V.D. Divekar's 4 or 5 volume bibliography is phenomenal in terms of knowing the entire statistical database, historical statistical database of India. It's like a nice 1-point source compiled in 1978. Right? So these are the 2 big files that one should have, and it's amazing how many times I refer to these sources during my research. Okay, I'm going to take like just 5 to 10 minutes and then move on to the next segment. So I'm going to be a bit selective of very quick answers. Kalyani asks on the side, hands-on experiences with data are working at NSS out of request on intergenerational. So, okay, the source for intergenerational mobility from NSS data is work by Sam Asher. So if you go to Sam Asher's website, you will see that. So it's that, and of course the source is listed within. There is now an interesting literature developing on intergenerational mobility. Classically, it uses father-son data from the IHTS, but there are interesting ways people are looking also now at the distributional sides of social groups and so on. Deepak Sharma asks, how do you find bordering distance between different states? Does the census code it? As I said, download that book. That book is going to be a savior. That book, you just have to keep the book on one side. And I'm very jealous that the book is now online, because when I was a PhD student, I literally photographed every page of the book in the library, and then I would look at the pages and so on. Today, it's a nice high resolution scan uploaded on the census website. Right? That is your answer to all district level questions in India, because you can really see the evolution of districts in India from 1872 to today. What you can't see is, of course, evolution of districts for Pakistan and Bangladesh, because it gives you only in the boundaries of India today. So for that, you need to look at the old census maps. So how can I trace intergenerational mobility using census data? I think you again look at Sam Asher work for NSS. With census, it's much tougher, but the NSS is really the place where you can. Navazuddin asks, census micro data for the sampling process. So that's a good question. Can you get individual data from the census? Actually you can technically. I mean, some universities, I remember JNU had this partnership. You can get these 5% samples from the census. So they'll release, a random 5% sample for researchers on request. Researchers have also requested specific types of tables to be generated for them. So the census does that, but it's not very public. So you need to have an institutional process, to get such micro data. So that is the problem. I do think, however, that there's not that much of a value addition. Much of the stuff that the census will give you at the micro data should be answerable by the NSS, NFHS, IHDS, right? So the value of the census really is just the whole thing, right? So beyond that, that 2-page questionnaire is better answered actually by the longer questionnaires of the NSS. So missing value, do you come across missing values? Yes, everyone comes across missing value. In fact, if you do a survey in your life, you'll realize there are a lot of missing values. There's no survey which respondents tick everything. And so missing values is a big reality of any data generating process. How do you deal with missing values is you don't drop those rows, as simple as that, you keep them, right? And so you always have a mental note of, so if you say, if I tell you 10% of Indians are receiving remittances, I should know what percentage of the data is simply not answering that question. In fact, that is something I have a mental note on virtually all the key indicators I'm working with, right? Because imagine 90% of your data does not tick this question at all. And then you claim that 10% of India is claiming remittances. Sorry, that's not very representative. Right? So you have to have a general sense of how does your data look? And that's why you should be working with the variables which are more complete. So you recommended a paper by Dyson. Could you share that for studying limited effectiveness of the public policy scheme? No, that was by Sam Asher on the Gram Sadak Yojana. So look up, that was in the American Economic Review, not by Dyson. Could not catch the name of the book. It's basically Sampling Techniques. This is that book by William Cochran. Can you send the name of the books in chat? Can you collect data on international migration via some primary data method? Any tips? As I said, there's an RBI survey, but otherwise you'll have to do your own things. Can we say that the way to understand, can we put IHDS data on a map? Yes, of course. You just have to aggregate IHDS data to the district level and then put it on the map. But like with the NSS, you have to be very careful about sample size. So the way, I've not used IHDS data too much, but if there are just 5 or 10 households in a district in the IHDS survey, in some districts, then I would be very, I would rather mark those districts as, as good as no data or inadequate data. I would want at least 150 or 200 households in a district to have some confidence in generating a district level estimate on a certain thing. That's my general rule of thumb, but it could differ. So that's the only thing. Yes, you can put IHDS data on a map, but do some robustness checks, see, and if there are districts with like 1 or 2 observations, just mark it as no data or inadequate data. And you can still show the map where districts have a decent sample and not. Can I get a historical data of biological science and some sub-disciplines of biological science of any university or college? Typically, these are from institutional archives, so you need to have an institutional archive base, not so much of the census. On special trains, again, not related with census NSS. So this widget, is it really possible to estimate district level estimates based on this? Is it really statistical valid? So all those questions. There is one paper, let me just pull it out for you. Poverty district level. It's, I think, an EPW paper in 2004. I just got it. Give me a second. So this is the question for everyone. This is the link. So I've given a link to this particular question on the EPW. It's a 2004 paper. It's a good paper. It tells you from when you can have reliable district level estimates of the NSS. It pretty much starts from that survey round. So before that, you have to be a bit wary of district level estimates. But after 2004, there's a change in the sampling design of the NSS, which made it possible to generate reasonably unbiased district level estimates. So I've shared that link. It's that particular EPW paper of 2003, which does that, and the authors of that paper. The link I sent was NS Sastry, but there's another paper, with 2 employees of the NSS who did that. So if you just Google district level poverty estimates in the journal called Economic and Political Weekly, you will get a nice paper written by 2 people on discussing all the issues related with district level estimates. Right, so that's the one. All right. So I think we should pretty much move on. How do researchers in other South Asian countries do researches with discontinuities in census data? It's a good question. How do people in Pakistan, Bangladesh do? Short answer, I don't know. So they must be relying more on maybe sample surveys. Any analysis using p-value which show correlation? So I'm gonna skip over that. Source for sanitation data for last 50 years. It's in the amenities file to a certain extent. For example, you find the number of toilets and so on. I'm pretty sure in the census. I think so, at the town level data and so on. So if you look at the town directory file, you might find something like that. Can you share my class PowerPoint? I think this, as I mentioned, the recording of this and the PowerPoint will be online. Can I find migration data of scheduled tribes from Rajasthan to Delhi over a period of time? It's a bit tricky because, as I know, there's some problem with scheduled tribe data collected in Delhi in the census. I think you're better off looking at the NSS for tribe data. There's a serious problem. The working group report of migration 2017 pointed out this important problem with the census data on migration and caste and tribe. So that's all right, so that's this thing. And if you have if you have your own answers to questions, please feel free to put it on the chat box. I'm going to take a 1-minute break to drink some water, and then we're going to start with part 2. Okay, so now in the next 40 minutes or so, we've talked a little bit the census and the NSS to give you a sense of how to access data. Some studies mainly on census on how people are using this to find interesting questions and so on. It's more on the empirical, large sample, large data size. So I'm going to move to now more simpler studies. Again, recollecting the first slide I showed you, the photograph, right? So these are much more. These are less numbers. This is more text. This is more qualitative, as researchers would call it, and also very useful to understand or make inferences of change over time, right? And because and there's a bit about history as to what historical research methods entail. I've shown you one aspect, that is using long-term time series, maps, etc. What it really means is crafting a narrative based on archival research and secondary sources, right? And so part of the quantitative methods, of course, is what we saw earlier, that is descriptive tables, statistical regressions, testing for causal mechanisms, and so on. And in qualitative methods, a very powerful tool is what we call as oral history. And another one which I'm going to talk about, which is corpus linguistics and discourse analysis. Again, of course, in history, like in everything else, we say sources matter. So what is oral history? Oral history is pretty much an interview of a person, capturing that person's memory. Now, in a way, you might ask, what is different between a simple interview and an oral history? Oral history is different because you're pushing the respondent to remember aspects of the past, right? And obviously, that is going to be quite inaccurate. Okay, if you ask me about my childhood, there's some things which I will have completely forgotten, some things which I will stress upon. So it is highly subjective, right? But it does capture some elements of what that person thinks has changed or not changed over time, right? And if you do sufficient number of oral histories, maybe once you transcribe these oral histories, the second step is to transcribe and make a transcript. Maybe if you did 50 or 100 oral histories on a particular topic, maybe you will see that there's a particular pattern being generated from these interviews, just like any qualitative research would show, right? The second part is corpus linguistic and discourse analysis, which is nothing but basically analyzing words rather than numbers. So how frequently does a particular word occur over time, right? And this is very useful because today we have digitized newspapers, digitized historical data, which you can sort of compile and analyze. And I'm just going to very briefly touch upon this, and feel free to take questions after. So quick note on archives. Again, the link that I've shared on the side, it's on my personal webpage and Google Sites. will have that has the updated list. But you should be aware that a lot of historical data exists in archives, right? And a lot of this is in government archives, the most famous being the National Archives of India, which has a ton of information on historical documents. And then, since I'm in a management school, there are business history archives. For example, the Tatas have an archive in Jamshedpur, Godrej has an archive in Mumbai, and so on. And a more complete list is on my website. But what is an archive? I should also mention, by the way, that the IIMA Ahmedabad, we have started our own institutional archive. So if you want to do research on the history of IIMA, if you're a person working on education, you can come to IIMA, sit in our archives and do research. You can also visit our website. It's called archives.iima.ac.in. And we've put a ton of information on the history of IIMA online, including oral histories and so on. And you can learn a lot about IIMA's history through that website. Okay, so what is oral history? The brief, how did it start? We said the census, like the US census started in 1790. The National Sample Service in India started around 1950. Roughly around that same time, oral history emerges as a discipline. And Columbia University started something called the Center for Oral History. And they, over time recorded over 10,000 interviews, right? So that's one of the largest corpora of oral history interviews that exists in the world. In 1996, there was something called as the International Oral History Association, which was formed. 1998, India, had a major effort. India, in the V.V. Giri National Labour Institute, set up something called as the Archives of Indian Labour. So if you're doing any work on Indian labour, you should know that there is a tremendous resource available at this institute, where a large number of interviews were not only captured orally, but also the interview transcripts are used. So you can go and read basically what those people said. And this covers a lot of the trade union leaders, a lot of the labor activists, workers, etc. It's a truly unique labor archive in India. So if you're doing any work on labor, you should know that this is a unique source that captures change over time, because these are reflections of people over time. I'm going to talk about the limitations of this method and the pitfalls as well. Okay, then there's this important work. For example, Urvashi Butalia had this great work on partition. There is now a lot of research happening on the partition of India by a variety of scholars using oral history, looking at the memory of the event to understand what exactly happened and how it happened and why it happened. Right? Similarly, on Bombay's textile workers, so Adarkar and Menon had this very famous book, 101 Years, 100 Voices, on what happened to the mill workers in Bombay, an oral history account. Okay. Now in India, the association really started in 2013. Indira Chaudhary, who did a lot of work on oral history, and Harvard Business School, HBS, has created a really powerful archive for business school practitioners and anybody interested in business. They interviewed over 100 leading business leaders worldwide, including I think almost 20 or more in India. All those interviews are online. All the transcripts of those interviews are available freely online, which means you can go to the website of HBS Creating Emerging Markets, even see the videos, but more important, you can download the PDFs and you can actually work with it as textual data. So you can use existing qualitative research methods to go through the data and generate patterns as to or what people call as coding, code paragraphs and say what are the basic themes which are emerging from what people are saying. In 2016, the IT industry in India launched a major oral history project called itihasa.com. It's actually a mobile app. You can download it if you're interested and you can see it. And in 2018, there was something called the IIMA Archives Oral History Project, which we started. Okay, so this is how that app looks, the Itihasa app. It's a phenomenal app, and if you want to know the history of India's IT industry, this is a tremendous resource to have. Again, the transcripts also you can access. This is a book on Bank of Baroda, which is also based on oral history. So oral history, very simply, is an interview. Now, I've done several oral histories, part of my research on migration. I started off with that photograph of the migrant family. I've done a lot now for my institution, interviewing past students, past faculty on their time at IIMA. So, what's great about oral history is, first, it has to be a recording. You can't just, the sound recording is a very critical element of oral history, right? Because it gives a very different texture. Recently, by the way, the Prasar Bharati has released a huge thing online, which is the Constituent Assembly debates. And you can actually, for the first time, hear, Ambedkar, hear these famous leaders from freedom movement debate the famous, things in late 1940s. thanks to this particular digital archive. Now, that is not strictly speaking an oral history, but the recordings, the voice recordings, make for a completely different experience as a viewing or a sort of a researcher's experience many years down the line. Because what often happens is when you transcribe something or when you put things on a paper, you often lose the tonality, right? You often lose what this person is implying, whether this person said it with a laugh or whether this person was joking about it. A lot of the context is actually lost when you do the transcription. Okay. Now, a lot of important research papers have also started being written in leading, journals in management, for example. There's a journal called the Strategic Management Journal, and this Harvard Business School project on creating emerging markets was actually published out there, where they compared the responses of business leaders across the world and how they navigated, different political uncertainties over the last 7 or 8 decades. So the challenges, of course, is accuracy, and it is tough enough to do a general interview and try and get accurate answers. In oral history, you're tapping into people's memories. So this is very tough because people forget. And so the way to get around this is by subtly asking similar questions at two ends of the interview, and then making a kind of prodding the person, saying that, but you said this then, are you sure about this? Often the person will change the stance to, oh, you're right, actually, I might don't or take this off the interview, or something like, maybe we should keep it as uncertain. Maybe this actually did not happen. Right? So these are the kind of responses often you get. It's also very ascertaining time in relatively illiterate populations is also very difficult because there's an opportunity cost in terms of time and so on. It's tough to get consistency across interviews. So you do an oral history for a project. Say you want to understand how, as I think somebody's pointing out, how the teaching of biology has changed across India over time. You would want to interview faculty across generations and get a sense of what they were doing. But obviously, each person is fairly different. And so how do you get consistency across interviews? So I, for example, use broadly some structure in the interviews in terms of questions, though the person is free to answer however long the person wants to. The quality of the recording matters. So obviously, sometimes you get bad quality. So you should have. So this is a general research tip that you should go with good recording systems. The meaning of words that you as a researcher ask may not be the same as the person is taking it to be. And so one thing is during the interview, you might want to try and be on the same page as to the basic or the most important words that's happening in the conversation. Then, like with any good research practice, you should take consent. You should get us typically, like when you do this IIMA archives, we get the respondents to sign a form saying they're okay giving their voices for posterity to us, right? And so getting that form is very important. Okay. And of course, the big thing about any research and interviews is how do you get secrets? So how do you get the really interesting parts of the interview? And that's more of an art rather than anything. And with enough time, I believe you'll find that a lot of interviews respondents waver across the narrative, and so getting them to really answer what you're looking for is a key part of this particular. Okay. And of course, you should not talk too much. So when I started out, I would end up asking or framing the context in such a large extent that actually it reduced the time which I could have got from the respondent to speak. So you want to ensure that you don't speak too much. So that's pretty much a very, very quick take through oral history, and I'll be happy to take questions when you ask. But I wanted to briefly flag it on because this is another of those things where you can get variation across space and time. And the Harvard Business School one is a phenomenal resource which does that. If you look at this, because they've got leaders in Africa, in Europe, across. You could do, if you're a researcher with smaller budgets, you could do it across a district, across any theme which you're interested in. How have people reacted to a famous public policy, for instance, if you're a public policy researcher? Get these interviews across the board, have a website, make video snippets, put it on there, make those transcripts available for all, and then you've created a fantastic resource for the research community to tap into the memories of people on a particular topic. Okay, and if you want to have an example, do look at the Harvard Business School Creating Emerging Markets page, and do have a look at also the IIMA archives page on our website. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about corpus linguistics. Okay, broadly, it means how do you analyze language, and how do you generate a particular discourse or identify patterns in discourse out of it. So this is broadly not the analysis of numbers, which is what we saw in census and NSS, but the analysis of text. Okay, And a great resource out there now for us researchers in India is digitized newspapers. Now, obviously, not all newspapers are digitized, and some or not all of them are. I don't think there's a single newspaper which is freely accessible. So this, unlike census and NSS, is not very democratic. You need to have a good library access. So the IIMA library access, for example, subscribes to I think 5 or 6 digitized newspapers. But I'm going to talk about the most famous one, which is the Times of India. Now, the Times of India started in India under a different name in 1838. Right? And what they've done is through ProQuest digitized every single page of the Times of India since 1838 till date. Now, that's a tremendous source of information for a person interested in understanding change over time. Of course, it's limited. It's a Bombay-based newspaper, so it's limited to understanding pretty much Bombay and Western India. It is the English language, so it's not, they're not capturing much outside it. But still, in my view, tremendous to understand identifying discourses. If you want to understand how did this discourse on socialism or capitalism start, these are words, these are English words, but they would have come about in newspapers, right? And so what you can do is look at when do these words first start coming. You can generate simple ratios like percentage of how many times the word appears in a particular year divided by the total number of articles published in that year, and see how those statistics change over time. Now, if you have decent software, some of these newspaper archives like The Economist, The Financial Times magazine, and so on, again, a list of some of these archives are there on my website, though I don't think you have access to it unless your library subscribes to them. But some of these websites themselves provide you the toolkit to do stuff like frequency count analysis. So you can see how many times the word, say, growth, economic growth, appears in the Times of India on a daily basis. You can create a daily time series of the word economic growth from, in theory, 1838 to now. It's a very powerful source of data to understand change over time. Okay, so why is this useful? Because many concepts, many things that you want to see, you want to have this question: when did this first start? Right? When did this thing come into vogue? And we're saying that newspapers capture some elements of this, obviously not all. And so, if you analyze newspapers, you might get some insights into when this concept of a particular word comes into being. You can also do cluster analysis. You can look at that particular word and see how that word is associated with other words over time. Now, what software? So the Google Ngram is the most popular. It's free. You can go to Google Ngram and just type it out, but that's not much to do with India. Right? So these are mostly books digitized in the English language, and so there's not much to do. There's a software called Wordsmith, which you can play around with, and that you can do some of the stuff like frequency count analysis, cluster analysis, and so on. But a lot of it is provided by the service providers themselves. So this is an example from a research paper of mine, which looked at, it's a paper on marketing history, since I'm based on management school. We're looking at marketing history. And it's a simple table. What does it show? It shows you the percentage of articles in the Times of India with the word and then selling, advertising, marketing, branding. That's the 4 common words that we use. And what it shows, of course, is like a word like branding is pretty much nowhere, and it kind of just about comes into the sort of discussion after the liberalization period, that is 90s. But what's interesting is the word marketing, right? And that the word marketing, for example, was always used less than the word selling throughout, until very recently, where the word marketing is now used much more in the popular discourse, so to speak, than even the word selling. Right? So in terms of the concept, we can say something about what the word marketing means vis-a-vis the word selling. They seem to be saying similar things, but obviously quite different. But what's really interesting for me was that before doing this analysis, I had no clue how the word marketing was actually used in India and for what. And so what I learned through this, looking at this discourse analysis using the Times of India database, was to see that in the 1930s, you'll see this number jumps up from 0.3 to 0.7. So suddenly in the 1930s, there's a substantially higher usage of the word marketing. And so I zoomed into the 1930s to see what was happening. And it turns out that what India had set up, British India had set up, was these agricultural marketing boards, right? And it's amazing that India had marketing officers first and foremost not in the industrial sector, but in the agricultural sector. In terms of the actual word marketing, it was not in the a private sector, but it was in the government sector. Right? And so APMC, for example, the word market also comes from it. So marketing in India actually as a word first came about in the agricultural sector, in the government sector, completely opposed to our common notions that it had come in the private sector, or for example, that it only started with the 1990s and so on. So this I found is a very powerful way, and I've been started using this for a variety of things I'm doing. So you can look at migration, look at words. I've got a recent project on old pandemics and so on, and use similar things to see how diseases, to see which diseases were being more talked about over time. You can just run this analysis through the digitized Times of India archive. Now, there are some other archives digitized, but you need to know those particular offices, go there, sit down and work with them. It's not as easy as sort of click and analysis if you have your institutional library subscribing to these databases. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and in good time for questions on either this really brief segment or earlier otherwise, and be happy to take more questions. But I just wanted to sort of give this flavor of two important qualitative research methods, which is oral history and discourse analysis, which again I'm trying to push you in this whole workshop to think of doing research which does use the element of time. So this idea that you have to be a historian to know long-term changes, I don't think is correct. A lot of these data sets are easily available today, even at lower times. All right, so I'll stop here and be happy to take questions. Thank you. Right, so there's one question on by Sabah again on a separate mode. How to address OCR errors in the digitized version is a issue I'm facing. Now, this is a very, very good question, very important. So for those who don't know, when you digitize documents, OCR, optimal character recognition, whenever you scan a document, always scan it in OCR form, which means it is word searchable, right? So never scan it like a simple photograph. That's useless for research purposes. Always do OCR scans. But unfortunately, OCR scans are not perfect, right? And especially if you're scanning an Excel table, right? It is definitely not going to be perfect. So I mean, there's no clear answer to this. I've kind of given up on OCR scans of old census documents. It just does not do good work. So if you have the budget, go for simple data entry operators who will do the job. If you don't have too much to convert, there is simply no strict answers to how do we deal with OCR scans. You have to understand, you should never blindly digitize especially old PDF containing a table into Excel and think that it's all fine, right? Always do the balance checks, always go through the numbers, and you'll find that for especially old census documents, I have not found any software or any service which does a great job. So the only alternative is for good old manual hand entry. When I was a PhD student, I used to do that myself. Now with some budget, I'll outsource it to a data entry operator. You should know, for example, Dave Donaldson wrote this huge thing on railroads of the Raj. He looked at district level data of India from 1870s to 1920s, and he basically mapped out the impact of the growth of railways on a variety of things in India, agriculture and so on. And he basically outsourced this whole data entry process and got it into spreadsheet form. So given a choice between OCR and data entry, I'd go with data entry. I don't think the OCR technology is still so good to make good things. This is for old documents. For new age documents where you have clearly where it was nicely printed out in the first place, it's fairly simple. And I do have a very simple PDF to Excel kind of a software, which I do use often. When I download a report, I quickly convert to Excel, have a quick check, and those seem to work. So it's a trade-off between how old the document is. The older the document, less reliance on OCR scans and so on. Now, when you use the Times of India database, the OCR scans can be quite problematic. They'll often pick these 3 dots and so on. So I do have a paper on Corpus linguistics. You can see it up online. It's on my webpage. It looks at the pitfalls of some of these methods that might shed some light on that. Yeah, so then there's a question on what's the idea of writing my new books. For those who don't know, my second book releases today, so it's a very happy day. It's called The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, how they shaped India and the world. So please read that book and buy it because it's very topical. Why did I write the book? Simply because often we think that this is the first pandemic that really hit India, but no, the pandemics of cholera, plague, and influenza were quite lethal and wiped out 40 million Indians. And surprisingly, we don't know much about it. And so I thought, what better time to write a book than during the pandemic. Are there any data entry operators specifically getting to academia? That's a great question. We are looking into that. I can answer maybe in a few months. So this is, I did have a data entry operator in Mumbai. It was quite awful, a bad experience. And so, but I was doing something many years back, and now I'm again doing a lot of data entry kind of work for which I need that service. So we should keep in touch. If you find somebody, please let me know, and vice versa. How useful is RTI as a method to access government committee reports and statistical data? What could be the alternative? I think it's very useful, but you're not going to get too much. I think it's useful. I think the purpose of RTI is not so much as research as to really press accountability onto government services. So I've not really seen too many solid research papers which uses RTI data in research. It's of course innovative, it's creative, but I do think the principal purpose of RTI is of course to hold the government accountable. And so I've not really seen too much on that. So there's a question by Varun. We have ECR migrant and remittance data of the period from 91, but not on overseas. No, the overseas data on migration is only for specific benchmark time periods given by the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. Even that is highly problematic. I pointed out to them long back that they had an extra zero for Burma. It was supposed to be 200,000. They had it as 2 million in that Excel sheet. And so the overall, the High Committee report on diaspora, I believe, got the number wrong substantially. They said 20 million Indians, when actually the number was something like 13 million with an error of 2 million. And they rounded it off to 20 million somehow, but it was much lower at that point. And since then, they've just been bumping up those numbers. So there's some problem in that data. So there's a question by Abhishek on riots. I think it's a very good question. It's a question on looking at can we use corpus linguistics and newspaper data to see changes in the way one perceives advertising and marketing sentiments? I think you have to be very creative. Look, the Times of India does actually have an identifier on advertisements. You can download literally hundreds of thousands of advertisements from the Times of India and do a nice analysis. In fact, I have students who do this every semester. They look at Horlicks or some brand and how their advertising strategy have changed over time. But I think what you're trying to get at is sentiments and so on. It's possible, but it's going to be tough. I think that's the thing. And it's only one part of India, that is Bombay Times of India, right? So I would just say look at this resource. If you've never looked at Times of India, look at it because it's important. Similar question on how do I get access to Times of India is basically come to IIMA library. That is one answer. But there are now some libraries in India, and I would say leading cities, which do give access. So you should basically tie up with that, spend some time there, and get access. Unfortunately, it's very expensive, so not all libraries have. So we are right now at that stage where we were with NSS data, 25 years back. Only few people could have access. So fortunately, I'm one of those persons who do have access to it. And sincere apologies that many of you don't have access. But if you're in Ahmedabad, you can always drop by the IIMA library, spend a few hours, collate some data from the Times of India, but do have a look at it. I mean, whenever you can, because just think about it. You can see every article published, every advertisement, every classified ad. It's a tremendous resource. Right? So that's definitely something. Andhra asks, where would something like the approach of historical materialism fit into the approaches to historical research? It's a very deep question. I don't have a clear answer to this. I just say that I look at historical research from more of a sort of sense of fascination of change, continuity, persistence, divergence over time. finding patterns and something that might be of interest, something that could even have relevance for today. For example, this work on pandemics, on migration, for example. There's a section in my book, in my new book, where I look at how we could have maybe done things so differently this year. I mean, I'd argued this even before we had the lockdown, but we had this huge unnecessary migration crisis this year. So I do think there's a value in looking at historical episodes, and while every episode is unique, I mean, no pandemic is the same. There are certain principles, which is quite useful, and so there is value in history, not so much for materialism, but for actually relevance for the current times. So Abhishek says the TI archive is itself not searchable. Once we attract PDFs from the archive, was there any got another problem? That's a good point. What I've been doing is basically word count frequency. So you search for, say, socialism or capitalism. The Times of India gives you a nice histogram of the site, right, which gives you the distribution. And I basically input that distribution from that histogram. Unfortunately, manually, I do it on a decade basis, typically. But if you look at the Financial Times or the Economist digitized newspapers, they are not ProQuest, they are from Cengage. They give you simple, you can actually download the whole thing in Excel. So those data service providers are much better currently than ProQuest or Times of India. I have downloaded PDFs and kept it, but I've done that on a very limited basis. You're right that there needs to be a way to convert the PDFs into pure OCR and then get it into like NVivo, qualitative resource package, and then do a mass analysis of PDFs. Possible, but as of now, I have not gone to that step. So if you've done this or you're going to do this, let me know. Can corpus linguistics and discourse analysis be used for social media too? Absolutely, but the only thing is I don't know the techniques how you do this, but people do this. People analyze Twitter content. People analyze, so this is the whole branch of natural language processing. There's a whole branch of AI, machine learning and stuff, which is using social media textual content and analyze that. But I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to comment too much on that. So the ideology of the newspaper. Look, this is a newspaper. It's what you get, right? But I do find a lot of interesting things coming out from discourse analysis. So the ideology of the newspaper, obviously, ideally you would like to have many newspapers, but no, you're looking at articles, right? And it's not necessarily the op-ed page. And articles on average, I don't think, if you're looking at the average article on export growth in India, it's not going to be that ideological. So if you have a word, which is going to be fairly salient in the English language across time, I'll go with this idea that, it does tell us something. Classically, I mean, if you search for Ambedkar and Gandhi and so on, you can see it, Ambedkar, the relevance of Ambedkar really rising through the 1980s and 90s. What the silent revolution, North and so on. So you can actually see a lot of these interesting patterns. You can date them. You can see from which year it's really starting to rise. For my work on pandemics, for example, cholera was big, then plague, and so on. And you can see these shifts happening every year, the months, and I find it very fascinating. Okay, so there's an important thing that I've learned regarding Factiva. There's a question by Saloni on NSS employment. Wonder why wages figure do not exactly, employment numbers do match, but not wages. Could be missing values. It could be they should match in theory. Maybe the sampling survey weights you're not done too well. Maybe your conversion at the first stage from raw code to the end product is not perfect. My thing is, if it is not perfect to the, I would be uncomfortable with anything more than a 1% mismatch. Within a 1% band, it's fine, right? There might be some strange reasons for that, but in theory, it should be identical. Right? So I completely understand your concern because it's happened a lot with me as well. But in my case, I would then either call up the NSS guys and ask them what's happening, or ask some senior who's working with this data set, and so on. But at least with the migration stuff, I found everything matching the report, so I didn't find it a problem. There's a question on the side: do they exclude indentured labor data? Consider data when they're considering overseas migration? Not very clear about that question, but Kingsley Davis's book, the one I mentioned, Population of India and Pakistan, is the best source for overseas migration between 1834 and 1920 or so. So that's a great source on overall migration. But as I have argued in my book, India Moving, the bulk of migration was not indentured. And a lot of indentured migration happened to Assam, which was not overseas, it was overland. So there are these interesting things in the migration stuff. Somebody's asked me for my email ID, you can Google these kind of things. So I'm not answering that. So overseas data on migration, we can take that offline, not quite linked with census, NSS. Okay, this is a good question on Citizenship Act, Amendment Act, general population data, pandemic, and so on. How to generate such data when the entire control and the generation use of data is manipulated by government and a lobby, and so on. So that's an important question of, like I mentioned, without the Census of India data, it is quite possible that caste identities would not have been so salient. There's a research paper coming up on this. Without the census of data, it is possible that maybe the partition lines would not have been drawn the way they. So census data have been used for some crazy purposes. It is completely a fact that in the Holocaust used census data, the tabulating machines came from IBM and Nazi Germany and so on. So there are all these crazy stories about census and so on. But at its fundamental, if you're not going to link the census with the Aadhaar, with biometrics, etc., if it is just a simple data collection exercise, personally, I don't have a problem with it. But you're right that obviously, and that is why individual household level data should not be disclosed. Right? Now, there is concern that, by having religion data and so on, you make it more sensitive, politicians might misuse. I don't agree with that, because I think politicians in India know exactly where everyone in India is, whether or not the census is done or not. Right? And they're using completely different data sources to get to that. So the census in that sense is not. The census is a good statistical practice. I believe it should happen every 10 years because it tells you a big story of how India is doing. The major contribution of the census is to tell us of our population growth rate, right? Which for many decades was a big concern area. Now on the CAA, there's a concern, of course, that people don't respond correctly on questions of citizenship or place of last birth. So for example, if you're a Bangladeshi migrant who should ideally be mentioning your place of last birth or place of birth as Bangladesh, will not, simply because of concerns, right? And so there is an underreporting, for example, of Bangladeshi migrants in the census. I've got an article of this. But you can actually kind of have methods to say, okay, how much do you think is underestimated? But more importantly, the trend matters, right? And what I found is, for example, between 2001 and 2011, the percentage of Bangladeshi immigrants in India fell drastically. Right? And this is an important fact. And now the last 2 weeks have shown that Bangladesh's economy is doing really well. And who knows, in another 10 years, Indians might start going to Bangladesh in large numbers. So the census, the response to the census is guarded on certain questions. There's no doubt about that. The census itself creates categories, no doubt about that. And that's why I've given the link to that Sumit Guha paper in this presentation. Arjun Apudara had a nice paper on this also, on census and identity. But I believe that there's so much information collected from a variety of other sources. Census is the least harmless one, and I believe tremendously useful. Now, the big question is, will it be continued during the pandemic and so on? How will people's responses change and so on? I hope that it doesn't change too much. In my new book on pandemics, I do note how pandemics in the past did affect. When the plague was happening in 1911, the census officers found nobody at home because everyone had run away from the plague. So you might find that many empty houses in the census, so many houses which were empty, people have come back in the villages and so on. So it'll be interesting to see how the 2021 census plays out. And I believe that somebody should do a good study on the comparability of 2001 and 2011 and 2021. This question by Sandeep on SC/ST data on electoral politics research for Maharashtra. Again, not an expert on this, but the ambit of castes under the SCN or the tribes in ST has changed. This is not some fixed SC category. right? So when you say that the percentage of scheduled castes has increased from, say, hypothetically 15% to 20% in the region, there are two effects. One is net of all the demographic factors, that is fertility, mortality, migration. But there is also this thing about castes being added to the SC category. Right? So that's what we call as reclassification. Right? And maybe there are studies, I'm not aware of studies on this, might be a good study to look at the increase of the percentage of scheduled castes. In most parts of India, this percentage is increased. How much of it is due to reclassification? How much of it is due to migration? How much of it is due to fertility, mortality, net natural increase, and so on? I'm not aware. Maybe there are studies on this, but I'm not aware of this. For migration and pandemic, you should read my book on migration, on both migration and pandemic for that. I will be tweeting about the video when it's uploaded. Do consider having an extended research methodology program on historical, etc. I should just mention before leaving that the IIM does have, this is part of a series of things. So what you should do is just look at IIMA's research and workshop series and look for the next event. We had two very good sessions earlier in the month on different topics. This was one specific to a particular topic. So maybe if you just sort of hook onto yourself onto the series, just keep looking at the website regularly, you might find some topic which is of interest. All right, so with that, I'm going to end exactly, pretty much on time. Hope you enjoyed it. And since this is on Google, I guess, since it's eventually on YouTube and so on, I hope you viewers who are looking at this in the future also find something of interest. And feel free to get in touch to learn more about two remarkable databases, Census and the National Sample Surveys, and of course, a variety of other methods that we've discussed, like oral history and corpus linguistics, and of course, using digitized newspaper databases. And of course, do check out my books, India Moving and the Age of Pandemics, which coincidentally has released today. Thank you.